America. What a country. In fact, I can confidently say it is one of the countries of all time. For almost 2.5 centuries, the land of the free and the home of the brave has been the shining city on the hill, spreading the joys of democracy, liberty, consumer capitalism, and their cultural hegemony to all the grateful people of the world, including yours truly. Almost every single facet of my life is American. I earn my living on YouTube, meaning I am primarily an American taxpayer. The closest people in my life, to the point that they are actually family, are all from Texas. My first job was as a drive-thru operator for McDonald's, and the car I drive every day is a Chrysler built in none other than Detroit, Michigan. America has done a lot of great things. However, it has also done a lot of not-so-great things. Things that make it very hard to love them sometimes. And when learning about history, you end up subconsciously forming a view. One might even go so far to say a stereotype of what forms the core of a country and its people. But the unique thing about the United States of America is that they often define your perception of them preemptively. Because despite all that I've said thus far and all the examples I've given, all of us know what America is really famous for.
America, 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 fuck yeah, coming again to save the motherfucking day, yeah.
The age-old mantra of cutthroat business is expand or die. On a geopolitical macroeconomic level, this could be interpreted as an imperative to open new markets, and economic philosophers from Mises to Marx all agree on this principle. Whether you are pro or anti-capitalist, it doesn't matter. Everyone knows you need to fight for your market share. And when it comes to fighting, whether it be literal or metaphoric, there is one nation on Earth who has done it better than anyone else, before or since. From the international consumable trade, like cotton or tobacco, to the soaring heights of the Industrial Revolution, transcontinental railways, the invention of powered flight, the first generally available automobile to the public. Through its geographic position, abundant resources, and thriving business sector, the United States has dominated the global economy for over a century. And in that time, the United States military has guarded that dominance jealously while seeking to open new markets. The most famous of these would probably be Commodore Matthew Perry's mission to Japan, ending the Tokugawa shogunate's enforced isolation of the country, giving rise to the Meiji Restoration, and an economic boom the likes of which wouldn't be seen until the 1950s. Which, funnily enough, also took place in Japan, and it took place, for the exact same reason. The same reason as this video's title. Because to ensure global economic dominance, America's ancestor, the British Empire, demonstrated conclusively that controlling the world's seas is a prerequisite, and as such the United States would require a navy to ensure the security of their burgeoning commercial networks. But it's a lesson they took some time to learn, as the world's oceans have no shortage of men, empires, and pirates alike who want their own piece of the market. But while it had a very humble beginning, very soon, and with great violence, a new axiom regarding the United States was born. For the love of God, don't touch their boats. And today, we are going to learn how that advice was born, and what the consequences are for failing to heed it, as I present to you all part 1 of a handy 2-part guide to every single time someone has started a war by making the critical error of touching America's boats, be it interfering with commerce and trade, or shooting at US ships. And as you can probably see by the length of part 1, I mean it. Every single time. Though I should add as a disclaimer here, that this also means the visuals of this first episode won't be very exciting, given most of it took place before cameras were a mainstream thing. But, speaking of protecting trade, and if you yourself are worried about someone touching your boats or messing with your money on the virtual seas, may I recommend today's sponsor, NordVPN. We all need a VPN these days to keep us safe online, and in the age of AI scam bots as well as big data harvesters, it's more vital than ever. Thankfully, Nord, with its sleek, easy-to-use design, gives you the edge with no hassle. But they have so many quality of life features. Hell, Nord has an entire webpage dedicated to what these threats are and how to handle them. Everything from guarding your critical data inside applications to the impacts of cyber warfare. Which, as a military history YouTuber, pleasantly surprised me. Of course, all the other features are there too. Nord's Active Protection shields you from malware trackers and ads. They have an inbuilt dark web monitor that notifies you if someone tries to steal your credentials. MeshNet allows you to connect up to 6 devices remotely and securely, and it all comes with a dedicated IP that helps you to avoid capaches and block lists. Basically, if you can think of what a VPN needs to do, it does it. They have 24/7 customer support, a dedicated app for every device, and right now, you can get 4 months extra on a 2-year plan by clicking the link in the description below. They have a 30-day money-back guarantee, so you have literally nothing to lose by giving them a try. So please do give them a shot. Click the link in the description and get the special offer. Plus, you'll help the channel, and they are a long-time sponsor of this channel as well as my VPN of choice. So I can highly recommend them. Anyway, back to the video. "12 years ago, the forefathers of most of the people watching this video brought forth on the American continent a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal, endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, among them being life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." Now, of course, those rights were only extended to white landowning men, and 1 in 5 of the colony's residents were the property of said men. But at the time, such an idea was, if you'll pardon the pun, revolutionary. The modern concept of a democratic nation, a constitutional republic formed of a government that rules with the consent of those it governs, elected by the people, for the people. Whatever its flaws, and as the long list of amendments show, there were very, very many, the founding of the United States was a watershed moment in the history of mankind. Yet for all the nobility in its intention, how it came about was not as altruistic or as mythical as the legends written about it suggest. The truth of the matter really is a tale as old as time. Someone was f***ing with their money. And as we've established, part of not touching the boats is not touching the purpose for which they have those boats, getting or protecting their money. There's a reason why they have "In God We Trust" written on it. Throughout the 1750s, war was raging in Europe between the great powers, which, by extension, led to their colonies in the Americas. Britain found itself at war with both France and Spain, while fighting across entire continents. There was even a threat of invasion across the Channel, despite the best efforts of their Prussian allies. However, their strategic situation was not as bad as it seemed. The Royal Navy controlled the waves, and the American colonies had more than enough manpower to form regiments to fight, and fight they did. Known to history as the French and Indian War for reasons that should be self-evident, this conflict raged across the border between Canada and the colonies from 1754 to 1760, with American militias and British regiments of foot fighting side by side to vanquish their enemies for king and country, which they ultimately would succeed in doing, resulting in the British annexation of the entirety of the Great White North, along with half the Caribbean, confirmed with the Treaty of Paris signed in 1763. A great victory for His Majesty King George III, to be sure, yet it came with a very substantial caveat. A caveat best summed up by Marcus Tullius Cicero, later adopted, ironically, by history's most famous Frenchman, Napoleon Bonaparte. The sinews of war are infinite money, and despite her imperial reach, Britain didn't have anything like that. The crown was, as they say, skint, in the red, povo, stone flat, down and out, broke ass bitches to a man. Thus, the British government and its parliament drew the conclusion that since all the new territories and resources were located in the Americas, and that the colonists there would be the primary beneficiaries of all the new business opportunities that would inevitably spring up, they should be the ones to pay for the war to get them. Which seems fair enough to me, to be honest, but, Americans. So a wave of new taxes were levied on the 13 colonies to cover the cost of the war, the largest of which being the very controversial Stamp Act, while British troops deployed to the region for the hostilities were garrisoned there to secure the new territories. But in doing so, they signed agreements with the Native Americans while preserving the infrastructure of former French Canada, meaning that the colonists were limited in what commercial opportunities they could exploit, while being forced to share them with French Catholics, and still having to pay all the new taxes. Taxes they had no say on the enforcement or levy of, and this was on top of the worrying signs of abolitionism starting to spread back in England. All of this did not go down well. Things steadily began to escalate, resulting in various movements forming, the most prominent of which being the Sons of Liberty. It was then that Britain committed the famous cardinal sin. They impounded the ship of none other than John Hancock, a prominent patriot in the community who sourced his cargo in a more, creative/affordable manner. This kicked off a riot which tore through the city of Boston. This in turn led to an increase in the local garrison, which of course made the locals even more pissed off, which would then boil over in March of 1770 with the Boston Massacre. And it was this that drew a line in the sand. A line the British subsequently crossed by touching their boats. New England fishermen were barred from the cod fisheries offshore, taxes were imposed on basically every single product in the market coming into port, and trade licenses were savagely curtailed. So the Patriots decided to make it personal. If they're going to touch our boats, we're going to touch their tea. And we all know that story. Patriots dressed as Native Americans make the world's largest cup of tea of all time. A hilarious bit of protest to be sure, but the official British response to it was not their brightest moment. Because after struggling to take both their boats and their money, the British did some quick math and then made the absolutely genius decision that the logical next step was to try and take America's guns. Oh boy. After Paul Revere's famous midnight ride, the shot heard round the world at Lexington and Concord sent the regulars running back to Boston with the Patriots hot on their heels. And even though they failed to hold Bunker Hill, the British paid for every inch of it. Soon the entirety of Massachusetts was on fire, militias and resistance groups popping up everywhere, one of which stormed Fort Ticonderoga, seizing the fort's cannons. Cannons they then transferred to General George Washington, who subsequently used them to retake Boston itself. With a full-size port in their hands and every colony up in arms, there came a man who needs very little introduction. Captain John Paul Jones, who with his fellow privateers raised hell up and down the Canadian coastline, running the Royal Navy ragged. Then, once he got command of a small flotilla, he decided to take the, let's call it measured step, and sailed all the way to Britain and started sinking their ships in British territorial waters. The absolute madman. However, the problem with rebellions is, while they usually start strong with the initiative, once the evil overlords get organized, they usually start to unravel. And no matter what Mel Gibson claims in his movies, shit went south fast. Literally. The British launched a counter-offensive that sent the Continental Army into a death spiral. Unfortunately for them, though, that violates Rule 4 of dealing with Americans. Don't ever, ever, ever back them into a corner. The United States' first Christmas looked very close to being its last. So the German mercenaries laying siege to their camp across the river decided to celebrate the coming of the Lord in style. No one, simply no one, would be stupid enough to launch an amphibious assault in dinky rowboats across a below-freezing, fast-flowing river in the middle of the night. It wasn't until their bleary, hungover eyes opened on Boxing Day that they noticed an even colder feeling. The icy steel of a 3-point bayonet on the end of an American musket, whose owners decided that they were going to invite themselves to Christmas dinner. Washington's crossing of the Delaware led to the Battle of Trenton and later the Battle of Saratoga, victories which would convince France and Spain that these upstart colonials weren't just a rowdy bunch of rebels, but a brand new nation. With their backing, the Patriots had all the gunpowder, the means, and the method to earn their freedom. It wasn't an easy road, and it did hit an all-time low in more ways than one at Valley Forge. But eventually, with the aid of a clinically insane Prussian who loved himself a good Frankfurt, as well as the famous Marquis de Lafayette, the Continental Army was drilled into a well-oiled military machine, eventually trapping Lord Cornwallis and the Empire's main force in Yorktown, Virginia. They had an escape plan, but the French Navy had that one covered down quite comprehensively, driving the Royal Navy off in the crucial Battle of the Chesapeake. Out of options, out of supplies, and out of hope, the beleaguered British offered their terms of surrender. Terms which, after 12 hours of heated negotiations, General Washington accepted. The war for North America was over. And though the conflict would continue in Europe for 2 more years, the first modern citizens' republic was born. In 1783, the next Treaty of Paris, along with the very first Treaty of Versailles, yeah, wild, right, ended the conflict while acknowledging the sovereignty of the now United States of America. And it is here our story really begins. But as the saying goes, freedom isn't free. It came at a considerable cost. A cost shared by both France and Spain. Although, we could probably cover those with all the new trade deals we can sign. In fact, we could probably organise a bunch of different treaties with France, given how good of an ally they've been. After all, the French monarchy has always been a good creditor and a fixture of the European geopolitical landscape. I'm sure any treaty with the French monarchy, a government of that higher calibre, will be a fantastic long-term investment. Yeah, turns out revolutions are contagious, and the Americans weren't the only ones wanting to say F the king. Apparently, offering angry peasants cake didn't work. Maybe the French should try a Pepsi next time. In fact, that's what the trade treaty is for. That wasn't product placement, by the way, but this is shameless product placement. Remember to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the video thus far, and of course you can support me on Patreon if you feel so inclined. But most importantly, as you can see on screen, use promo code JDAM at checkout for your next Gamer Subs order. With that, back to the video. The issue is the King's government is who Big G and the boys signed that trade treaty with, along with all the other treaties. And you want to know what else? It was the monarchy who held the title and collateral for all of their war debts, not the French government, air quotes. So, seeing as the guy they actually owed the money to had his head chopped off, Congress decided that American money could be better spent elsewhere. Perhaps using it to back up that new banking system that guy Alexander Hamilton, I think his name is, whatever that thing he's been running. This did not make the French Republic very happy, as you can imagine. After all, they were fellow brothers in anti-monarchism, and like all rebel movements, they were broke as hell. But they could understand. After all, it's been less than 20 years since America's war for independence, so they probably need to look after their finances just as carefully. Except the French forgot one tiny little detail. Just because they got rid of King George, it didn't stop them being English. And if there is one thing an Englishman can't abide, it's the French. The American identity was still very new, and while the Jeffersonians were pro-revolutionary France, public opinion, as well as the more conservative factions in Congress, leaned far more towards rapprochement with the mother country, as opposed to alliance with the French. Also, the French are Catholics, so ew. As Europe's monarchies rallied to crush the insurrectionist revolutionaries from the French Republic, beginning the wars of the First Coalition, George Washington, staying true to his pledge of remaining free of foreign entanglements, lobbied Congress to pass the Neutrality Act of 1794, while signing executive orders to disarm US merchant vessels to avoid combat with the warring powers of either side. Yet at the same time, a treaty was concluded with Britain to finally normalize relations and resume the profitable trade relations they'd had during the colonial era, albeit on more even terms. Meaning now, American businesses and cargo vessels were directly contributing to Britain's war effort against revolutionary France. Okay, imagine you're the French, and that's a horrible thought, I know, but bear with me. These guys practically owe you their independence. And even while this war has been going on, they've been more than happy to buy plundered British loot off you. Everything from spices to captured vessels and, anything they can get their hands on. Yet now, after all of that, they are signing trade deals and singing Kumbaya with your mortal enemy of several centuries, who are the same guys who you helped them against and are now threatening to destroy your own revolution in the cradle. So the French decided that if the Americans are going to trade with the British, then American boats are fair game. Now, they really couldn't do much given the blockade of their coastline by the Royal Navy, but their colonial privateers and blockade runners already on the prowl officially declared open season, and the fight was on. Oh, woe betide them. Now, in fairness to the French, which is a sentence I hate saying, but here we are, they had good reason to be confident. As long as they could dodge the Royal Navy vessels in the area, the United States wasn't exactly a sea power yet. They only really had a few vessels left over from the war and a bunch still in the yards being built. So they figured on making a calculated risk. But, dear viewers, they did not fully appreciate just what kind of men they were dealing with. Because a gap in maritime security may seem like a national security issue, but do you know what an American sees? An American sees a business opportunity. Because the moment this crisis started escalating, wealthy citizens across the United States began funding their own privateering vessels, while a number of US cities crowdfunded others, naming them after their city or state of origin. If the French were going to go around playing finders keepers, then according to naval prize rules, whatever they carried was up for grabs. And when there is capital to be acquired, tactically or otherwise, the Americans are always to be found somewhere. And their sailors of fortune went on an absolute rampage. All across the Caribbean and North American coastlines, the privateers of both sides repeatedly clashed, all while searching for merchants to strategically transfer equipment from to an alternate location. And, rather appropriately, it was the USS Boston who led the charge on that front, with over 80 vessels seized, including a French warship, the 22-gun corvette Berceau, which she towed back to her namesake city in triumph. However, as impressive as that is, I have to make mention of something much closer to my heart and to the history of American sea power, because one of the most spectacular campaigns waged during this conflict was carried out by a small 12-gun vessel with a scratch crew and weapons half the size of her enemies. That ship bore the name USS Enterprise. Over the course of the conflict, she captured 8 French privateers, liberated 11 American trade ships, and fought the final battle of the war, where she defeated a ship that was both bigger and with heavier armament in one-to-one combat, utilizing superior gunnery and tactical aggression to not only defeat, but capture the French brigantine Flambeau. Her gallant heroics ensured that when Napoleon Bonaparte, the new consul of France, called for an end to hostilities in September of 1800, USS Enterprise was one of the vessels who would form part of the full-time United States Navy after the war ended. And she would most definitely be back. But do you know what the funniest thing is? The most impressive single naval action was not fought by either Boston or Enterprise. In fact, that honor belonged to one USS Pickering, a patrol vessel with only 70 crew and 14 4-pounder guns, who on one of her counter-privateering patrols to the West Indies fought a 9-hour battle against a French frigate 3 times her size, the French ship L'Egypte Conquise, and kicked their French asses so decisively they surrendered outright. And the best part is, USS Pickering was not a US Navy ship. Oh no. The USS Pickering was the first built and commissioned warship for the US Revenue Marine, an institution founded in 1790 to protect American shipping in the US coastline. They would later merge with the United States Life-Saving Service. Oh yes. That's right. The greatest victory of America's naval war against France was won by who else but the United States Coast Guard. Although it shouldn't be surprising given that these are the same dudes who combat board submarines. Semper Paratus, you magnificent bastards. We love the Coast Guard on this channel. After such an embarrassing turn of events, it's no wonder that the French decided to come to the table. I mean, there was also the tiny detail that the Royal Navy began working with the US Navy to guard supply convoys for their cross-Atlantic trade. Like, think about that for a minute. Imagine how badly you have to screw up to get the Americans and the British to work together on a convoy system in the 1790s. It took them over a year in both world wars to get that organized. Wait a minute. Hang on, I just realized something. I just talked about the founding and the first great victory of the US Coast Guard before I talked about the founding of the US Navy in a video about touching America's boats. Oh god, that's going to rustle some jimmies. I really don't want to rustle. They have like 11 aircraft carriers. I'm not going to mess with that. Hold on, I got to fix this. The year is 1785, and America is a thing. With their independence secured and the Revolutionary War over, we can demilitarize and go back to a militia-based military with the exception of a few standing forts in border regions and the capital. I'm sure essentially disarming ourselves is not a mistake we will make several times, and it absolutely won't bite us in the arse later on. Now, everyone watching this has probably seen the Fat Electrician's video on this, which is fantastic. But given that we are covering every single war caused by screwing with America's boats and or their money, I need to be comprehensive, and this is kind of important given that it founded the US Navy. So I'm going to cover all the Barbary Wars. Yes, all 3 of them. I know technically only 2 of them are called the Barbary Wars, but there was really 3 because it counts the conflicts before. Anyway, so yes, the year is 1785, and America is an independent nation, free from the British yoke. If only my country would be so lucky. But this had the rather unfortunate side effect that American trade ships filled with the rare and valuable commodities of the New World, as well as, long-term self-developing financial assets, were no longer under the protection of the Royal Navy, which meant all the security forces and tribute treaties protecting them from the world's various pirate kingdoms were no longer applicable to them. And once the world started calming down after the war, with Spain, France and Britain all coming to terms with each other, the oceans became a lot quieter, with far fewer naval vessels to stand guard over the trade lanes. Perfect conditions for some enterprising Arabs to make a literal and metaphorical killing. The Barbary pirate states, comprised of the various kingdoms along the North African coastline, were a constant menace to maritime trade in both the Mediterranean and Eastern Atlantic. In fact, they were so proficient in their trade of taking other people's trade that the various European empires found it much cheaper to just pay them off rather than devote the time, resources and manpower to subduing them. And there was also the slight issue that they were all technically subjects or tributary states of the Ottoman Empire, and getting too heavy-handed with them might provoke a larger confrontation in the region. But even with these stipends from the major empires, the crews of these vessels still had quotas to meet and families to feed. Their bosses got most of the bribes, because even in the pirate world, the boss still makes $1 as you make a dime. So they had to find other people to rob. And conveniently, one of the wealthiest commercial hubs of the British Empire recently lost all financial and diplomatic protection. Thus, they decided to start attacking American commercial shipping. On October 11th, 1784, the US trade vessel Betsy was seized by Moroccan pirates and its crew held for ransom. But, given that at the time Spain was still an ally of the United States at war with Great Britain, the Spanish government covered the cost and negotiated the release of the imprisoned sailors, along with their ship, on the understanding that these naive young colonials will look after themselves in future. To that end, the ambassador to France, one Thomas Jefferson, author of the Declaration of Independence and chief advisor to the Constitutional Convention, sent envoys to the various pirate kingdoms to organize treaties of friendship, or at the very least treaties of peace, in lieu of a more persuasive and expensive arrangement. At first, things went well. The Moroccan kingdom had fostered good relations with the Americans, and they had guaranteed the safety of US ships in their waters for the duration of the Revolutionary War. But pirates are a rowdy bunch by definition, and with the end of hostilities in sight, such agreements were, to borrow the words of a famous pirate, more like guidelines than actual rules. Yet, with both the Spanish and French empires as allies, the United States had powerful friends. Powerful friends less than a week's sailing from Morocco and forces powerful enough to crush them wholesale. Then again, this bunch of plucky colonials, come rising regional power, has just defeated the most powerful empire on Earth and has an incredible amount of upwards economic potential. Good relations with them could be very profitable in a long-term investment. Plus, they are an uncharacteristically friendly people as long as you offer them a fair deal diplomatically, or more importantly, for their merchandise. The Moroccan-American Treaty of Friendship was signed on June 28th, and it is to this day the longest-standing diplomatic arrangement in United States history. Negotiations with the other Barbary states, however, did not go as well. While discussions were ongoing with Morocco, the regencies of Algiers and Tripoli, instead of slowing down their operations to allow for diplomatic developments, viewed the American bargaining position as a sign of weakness and chose to expand their piracy campaigns, with the Algerians seizing the US ships Maria and Dauphin, only to then demand what at the time was an absolutely ruinous tribute in return for their crew's release. This naturally prompted an urgent diplomatic mission. Only when Thomas Jefferson, along with his fellow founder and ambassadorial colleague John Adams, tried to reach a similar accommodation of friendship, or failing that, a more affordable ransom to be paid, the response they received from Tripoli's ambassador, Sidi Haji Abdul Rahman, was the following. It was written in the Quran that all nations which had not acknowledged the Prophet were sinners, whom it was the right and duty of the faithful to plunder and enslave. In case you didn't understand the contextual diplomatic language of the period, that's Arabic diplomat speak for go f*** yourself. Now for us today, this would almost certainly elicit a response of eagle screeching and an Amazon Prime same-day shipping Tomahawk missile barrage. But that America was a glimmer of a time far in the future. The Continental Navy had been disbanded due to low treasury funds, while the Revenue Marine/Coast Guard wouldn't exist for another 4 years yet. And the European powers all had standing tribute treaties with all the Barbary states, meaning they couldn't directly intervene. The Congress and President Washington, realizing they had no leverage, accepted the reality of the situation and began drawing up a budget proposal to meet the pirates' demands. But there was one man among them who did not accept this state of affairs. They didn't throw off the most powerful force on the planet, only to kowtow to a bunch of seafaring criminal heathens. Thomas Jefferson, upon receiving such a belligerent diplomatic rebuffing, decided, in keeping with his character, that cowabunga it was. He went on an ambassadorial tirade across Europe, trying to assemble a coalition of the willing to launch an intervention against these avaricious Arabs. One might even say a storm of steel. A desert storm, if you will. But, as mentioned before, all the major players were already paying them off, and even though the minor powers like Portugal and Venice were strongly in favour of such a move, between all of them they could only muster a handful of ships and nowhere near enough soldiers. Thus, Jefferson concluded that if he couldn't handle this through diplomacy, he would have to resort to politics. Over the next few years, as Congress paid more and more of their meager budget in tribute to protect American sea trade, with some modern estimates putting it at around 20% of the entire federal budget at the time, calls grew louder to do something about this insulting affront to the nation's sovereignty, and more importantly, the violent assault on everyone's wallets. Eventually, after some very aggressive lobbying, Jefferson seconded an act to the Assembly for the executive branch's approval, the Naval Act of 1794, which was signed enthusiastically into law by President George Washington. This was a decisive step in the right direction, but as the axiom in military history goes, naval strategy is build strategy, because unless you are Kaiser shipyards in World War II, and trust me, we will get to that conversation at a later date, building and training even a small naval task force takes multiple years to do and a lot of money, both upfront and long term, which actually came in clutch against France during the last chapter because where do you think we got all those ships from? However, it wouldn't help the situation immediately, so the United States would have to keep paying tribute until the Navy's strength was sufficient to guarantee the protection of Atlantic trade. Yet although the shipyards produced vessels and the Department of the Navy was founded in 1798, there was an intense debate between the various factions of the Congress over how American economic policy should proceed. Manifest destiny was in its early beginnings. Expansion west into Native American territory was one of the main reasons the treaties signed by Britain curtailing it was so resented. Many felt that the future economic security of the United States would be best served by focusing all efforts on marching to the Pacific coastline, settling, seizing, and exploiting everything, while ethnically cleansing everyone on the way. Indeed, both the Jeffersonians and the Federalists agreed on this issue. The problem lay in how to pursue it. The national debt was expanding rapidly, while both the central government and the executive was expanding still further. Thomas Jefferson viewed this as an affront to the very ideals that America was founded on, a sentiment still found in the more traditional Reed-sane Republicans today. Maintaining a standing military force, as well as the various agencies to administer taxation and international trade, was an expense that many felt excessive, or in more radical quarters, completely unnecessary. But ironically, both the Federalists, led by Alexander Hamilton, and Thomas Jefferson himself, were in complete agreement. If we are going to spend a fifth of our budget on protecting sea trade, it will be spent on our terms, not theirs. So when the election of 1800 took place and Jefferson ran against his friend John Adams, whom he ultimately defeated, he did so with the pledge, "Millions in defense before a cent in tribute." Keep in mind this was taking place during the undeclared war with France, so this went for them as well as the Barbary pirates. Basically, under Thomas Jefferson, the official position of the United States government would inexorably shift from "let us seek an equitable compromise and resolve our differences" to the more familiar and, in my opinion, far more appropriate around and find out. And even though reinvesting in domestic expansion, albeit at the cost of ethnically cleansing and exterminating the Native Americans, would be far more profitable on the balance sheet, it was the God's damned principle of the thing. Either we defend our citizens and our money, or we just let armed men dictate terms to us and submit to their whims. To Jefferson, the choice was abundantly clear. And this moment was, as the memes these days so eloquently put it, the birth of the immortal phrase, "The United States does not negotiate with terrorists." Before Jefferson was even inaugurated, his allies in Congress passed legislation to outfit 6 naval frigates to be used at the president's discretion, with the purpose of, quote, "protecting commerce vessels and chastising the insolence of any who attack by sinking, burning, or destroying their ships and vessels wherever you shall find them," end quote. This happened to be excellent timing, as mere days after his assuming office, Yusuf Karaman Ali, the regent of Tripoli, sent a missive to the US government stating that as a new president or consul had taken power, he must by tradition renew his treaty obligations by paying homage and tribute to the tune of $250,000 on top of their regular tribute. $250,000 in the 1790s. In response to this demand, Jefferson, rather appropriately given Tripoli's North African location, told the regent to pound sand. But he did it in a letter which, in my opinion, is the greatest piece of passive-aggressive diplomacy I have ever read. And in keeping with the vibe that this letter contains, I shall read it in the style of everyone's favourite vampire, and hope Takahata 101 doesn't judge me too much.
Dear and respected friend, the assurances of friendship which our consul has given you, and of our sincere desire to cultivate peace and commerce with your subjects, are faithful expressions of our dispositions, and you will continue to find proofs of them in all those acts of respect and friendly intercourse, which are due between nations, standing as we do in the relations of peace and amity with each other. At the conclusion of our treaty with you, we endeavoured to prove ourselves contented with it, by such demonstrations as were then satisfactory to you. And we are disposed to believe that, in rendering into another language those expressions in your ire of your last letter, which seem to imply expectations inconsistent with the faith of that transaction, your intentions have been misconstrued. On this supposition, we renew to you sincere assurances of our constant friendship, and that our desire to cultivate peace and commerce with you continues firm and unabated. We have thus found it expedient to detach a squadron of observation into the Mediterranean Sea, to superintend the safety of our commerce there and to exercise our seamen in their nautical duties. We recommend them to your hospitality and good offices should occasion require their resorting to your harbours. We hope that their appearance will give umbrage to no power, for while we mean to rest the safety of our commerce on the resources of our own strength and our bravery in every sea, we have yet given them in strict command to conduct themselves towards all friendly powers with the most perfect respect and good order, it being the first object of our solicitude to cherish peace and friendship with all nations with whom it can be held, on terms of equality and reciprocity. I pray to God, very great and respected friend, that he may have you always in his holy keeping. Sincerely, Thomas Jefferson, President of the United States.
Now, to translate that from 18th century, basically, oh, I'm sorry, I don't think I heard you correctly. Did you say you want us to pay you more?
Well, I'm afraid we are altering the deal.
We are now equals in this trade partnership. However, we mean only goodwill. In fact, we are sending our entire navy to visit you to show just how much goodwill we have for you. Please receive them in friendship. Or, to translate that into even more modern and direct vernacular, this was, yet again, say it with me everybody, a case of f*** around and find out. Needless to say, the response to this letter was a company of Tripolitanian soldiers marching to the US consulate in Tripoli and cutting down the flagpole, which in that part of the world is an official declaration of war. Now, it should be mentioned that the captains of the various US naval vessels had been ordered that no overt hostile action was to be taken, as Congress had not officially voted to declare war. However, under the rules of engagement and sensible naval conduct, they were technically on a diplomatic mission to foster peace and friendship with the Barbary states. They even had letters of friendship and gifts aboard for that very purpose. Not for the actual seeking of peace, of course, but as a form of insurance. For you see, diplomatic missions are sovereign representatives of the nation as a whole, meaning that an attack on them would essentially be an attack on US territory and sovereignty, which subsequently means all methods must be taken against any potential hostile action by any party. Note the key word there, potential. And remember that their orders to sail came under the legislation making the President Commander-in-Chief of this particular naval squadron, allowing him to order them to conduct every form of naval action except outright aggression. The President could order it, not Congress. In other words, Thomas Jefferson was saying, "Get 'em." Joining up with the Allied powers of Sweden and Sicily, the latter providing the Americans with a forward operating base on their shores in Syracuse and Palermo, the US fleet began offensive operations in the Mediterranean against the Barbary corsairs, joining in a blockade of Tripoli itself. Naturally, with their capital besieged, the Tripolitanian ships broke out into the open waters and sought to do battle. At their head sailed the flagship which bore their city's name, Tripoli. To counter this threat, the United States Navy sent a vessel of their own, their most belligerent, crafty, and some might even say battle-hungry ship in their fleet. On the 1st of August 1801, as the Tripoli sailed the seas alone between their city and the island of Malta, a ship flying British colours closed on them carefully. After they got within range, a loud voice rang out, asking the Barbary sailors what they were doing all the way out here. The pirates replied, saying that they were out looking for American ships transiting from Sicily to the blockade. Upon hearing that remark, a reply came back to the effect of, "Oh, you're looking for Americans? We can help you with that." The Union Jack flying at the back of their ship came down, quickly replaced with the unmistakable visage of Old Glory herself, the stars and stripes fluttering in the breeze, and underneath the flagstaff, they could just make out the name of the ship engraved on the stern. The nameplate read, Enterprise. Before the pirates could even process what was happening, a volley of cannon and musket fire slammed into them. The Americans' attack was so vicious that Tripoli attempted to run for it, but USS Enterprise pressed the attack and chased them down. In desperation, they then tried a boarding action, but the United States Marine Corps is not exactly known for sharing anything, let alone their boats, and they responded with an exceptional amount of violence. Faced with Uncle Sam's misguided children and unable to run away, next they tried fake surrendering. In fact, they tried several times, but Enterprise's captain was too smart for that. He aimed his cannons at the Tripoli's waterline and started blasting. Eventually, the damage was so severe and so many of the crew were dead, Tripoli's captain ordered the colours thrown into the sea as a signal of permanent surrender. Enterprise closed in for the final time, tore down the masts, wrecked the sails, and told them to paddle their way home. The US sailors had been told they weren't officially at war with the pirates yet, so they weren't allowed to take prizes. But I think the Tripolitanians got the message. America had just won her first victory over the Barbary pirates, and the number of American casualties? 0. This action, along with the official declaration of war, allowed Congress to authorize President Jefferson as Commander-in-Chief to order full-scale anti-piracy operations on a war footing, allowing Tripolitan vessels to be seized and their cargo to be, as the saying now goes, strategically transferred to alternate locations. Any who refuse to comply will be greeted with an appropriate amount of democracy. The US Navy would continue aggressively pursuing pirate vessels all across their trade routes while blockading the city of Tripoli itself for the next 2 years. It was then, in October 1803, the USS Philadelphia ran aground in Tripoli Harbour while on patrol, and she was subsequently captured with all aboard being taken hostage. And given that they weren't able to sail on their own ships right now for obvious reasons, the pirates converted the Philadelphia into a floating shore battery to guard the harbour entrance and fire on the vessels maintaining the blockade. This embarrassing, borderline humiliating situation could not be allowed to stand. Imagine sailing past a ship your colleagues ran aground that is now flying your enemy's flag and firing on you every day. The honour of the United States Navy was at stake. Thankfully, though, a young officer, one Stephen Decatur, newly minted commander of the one and only USS Enterprise, had a plan. One might even say a cunning plan. For you see, last week he had been in command of an action against the Tripolitan vessel the Mastico, a small ketch-class ship sailing under Ottoman colours illegally without proper documentation. And seeing as Decatur's ship seriously outgunned them, he decided to seize the vessel with his marine contingent aboard, which after a very short battle they subsequently did. They then ended up towing the Mastico all the way back to the US Navy's forward headquarters in Syracuse, and once there the Mastico was quickly patched up and upgunned to American specifications, and it came complete with a new name, the USS Intrepid. A name which would turn out to be rather appropriate, because it was at this moment that Stephen Decatur's mind started churning. Philadelphia has been a political and literal thorn in our side for the past few months, so much so that Commodore Preble is considering any and all options for solving the problem. It was then the proverbial light bulb, or I guess a gas lamp at this stage, went off. I've just captured an enemy ship, and the Sicilians here are multilingual with a dark Mediterranean complexion. I have an idea. On the 16th of February 1804, the pirates aboard the captured USS Philadelphia were standing guard as normal, overlooking Tripoli's harbour. In the distance, they could see the lights of several coalition ships patrolling the waters out to sea, maintaining the blockade of their city. It was then that out of the murky darkness emerged a small ocean-going vessel flying the ensign of the British Empire, slowly approaching their position. Doing their duty, they immediately yelled out a challenge. Identify yourselves immediately, or you will be fired upon. The ship edged closer into the lantern light, revealing 5 men, clearly dressed in Arab clothing. The helmsman, serving as the pilot, responded to the challenge. "Assalamu alaikum, brothers! We have come to aid in the city's defense." As he kept talking, the ship steadily pulled alongside. "We managed to get through the blockade just barely by the grace of Allah and the Prophet, peace be upon him. We passed the outer picket defenses and we were just coming to— Now!" At that moment, a voice in English screamed from below deck, "Board!" The pirates had absolutely no time to react, as the crew of USS Intrepid, led by Lieutenant Decatur himself, all of them dressed and armed in the Arab style with swords and pikes, stormed the ship with speed, aggression, and the violence of action. The few men on deck watch were killed outright as the Americans stormed aboard. Within minutes, the ship was under their control. Without missing a beat, Lieutenant Decatur ordered fires be lit at strategic points across every deck to ensure USS Philadelphia's destruction. Make sure the enemy can't have nice things. And once this was done and the blaze took hold, he led his men back aboard Intrepid and made a mad dash towards the open sea. Tripoli's defenses unloaded on them with everything they had, but their comrades aboard USS Siren had been waiting for this very moment, unloading full broadsides at the coastal fortifications. Living up to her name, Intrepid barely escaped intact, filled with shrapnel holes and the sails torn to shreds. But she made it back to Syracuse nonetheless. And once again, not a single American died during the action. When news of this mission made it to the world's press, Lord Admiral Horatio Nelson, the soon-to-be famous victor of the Battle of Trafalgar, called Decatur's exploits the most bold and daring act of the age. Stephen Decatur became a national hero, and for the rest of the war aboard USS Enterprise, he would hunt down any pirate vessel still afloat in the Mediterranean. The most notable exploit of these being his crusade for vengeance against the pirate captain who murdered his brother while feigning surrender. Decatur sought the man's ship out specifically, and when he found it, he insisted on boarding the enemy vessel himself to challenge his brother's murderer in single combat, which he did. The crew was outnumbered 3-1, but the Americans, through superior training, began to prevail. Decatur singled out the enemy captain and fought a brutal sword duel which he actually lost, only to, at the last minute, pull a Jack Sparrow, pin the pirate captain's sword hand with his weak arm, draw his flintlock pistol with his right, and fire into the pirate captain's chest at point-blank range, killing him dead. After the war ended in June of 1805, he was recognized for his bravery in action, outstanding leadership, and battlefield success. Stephen Decatur, at the age of 25, became the youngest captain in US Navy history, promoted to command none other than USS Constitution, Old Ironsides herself. Yeah, Stephen Decatur commanded USS Enterprise and USS Constitution, and had the Medal of Honor existed at the time, he almost certainly would have won it. This man was an absolute legend. A legend we shall also hear more badass stories about a bit later. With the way to Tripoli now clear, the US Navy began an active campaign to take the city. But it was so well fortified that even though they won most of the tactical engagements, none were decisive enough to break the deadlock. So, with direct military force out of the question, the United States would start another long-running tradition. If we can't defeat an enemy directly for whatever reason, be it a military impasse or geopolitical interests preventing us from committing our full might, which in this case it was both, then we only have one option. Stage a coup and put our own dictator in place. Besides, backing a coup in an unstable Middle Eastern warlord state could never, ever backfire on us. What's that saying about history rhyming? Anyway, the US government sent out a small contingent of Marines under the command of two men, one William Eaton and one Presley O'Bannon, along with a flotilla of ships led by the USS Nautilus under the command of one Oliver Hazard Perry. Fun fact, both O'Bannon and Perry would have US Navy light surface combatant classes named after them. This small force sailed to Egypt to meet Hamid Karamanali, the brother of Yusuf Karamanali. This former regent of Tripoli had been deposed by his brother, and the US government came up with an offer to hire some mercenaries, which they would then use to reinstall him as the leader of Tripoli, so they could end the war and build a new alliance. Hamid Karamanali readily accepted the offer, and so, after hiring a motley band of mercenaries from a bunch of different countries, which took all the diplomatic skills of O'Bannon and Eaton to prevent from killing each other, eventually they reached the city of Derna in modern-day Libya, a major port city located across the Gulf of Sidra from Tripoli itself. It was a crucial strategic location. In fact, control of it would be a major strategic factor of wars in the region for over a century to come, as it was the Africa Corps' forward headquarters during the Second World War, as it straddles the main coastal road east towards Cairo and west towards Tripoli. That gives you an idea of just how important this city is. With the backing of the US flotilla offshore, the would-be insurrectionists delivered a message to the governor of Derna, asking him to recognize Hamid Karamanali as the true ruler of Tripoli, and to grant both supplies and passage to the capital to seek his righteous vengeance. The governor, in response, sent a simple message back. My head, or yours. Well, violence it is. The battle was fierce, and after the initial volley of fire, the mercenaries hesitated. But the US Marines had a different reaction. They got angry. You see, they weren't killing anyone, and they couldn't eat anything with all the lead flying around, and all the local women were inside the city. So there was only one practical solution. William Eaton climbed the embankment with swords drawn and bayonets fixed. The Barbary troops fired everything they had, but it wasn't enough to deter the squad of very angry Marines who immediately charged the gun batteries defending the city head-on, dodging musket balls and murdering anything that got in the way. The captain of USS Argus out in the bay observed the action through his telescope and recalled the Marines gaining ground very fast through a heavy fire of musketry. Eventually, the defense of the city completely collapsed, with Lieutenant O'Bannon climbing the city walls and raising the Star-Spangled Banner for the first time on foreign soil in history, which is where we get the line in the Marine Corps hymn, "From the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli." He then turned the captured guns on the city and blasted the retreating Tripolitan forces, taking the city outright. The regent of Tripoli, realizing that losing Derna would pose a severe threat to his landward defences, sent a relief force to retake the city, only to get absolutely obliterated by the US Navy, who by then had anchored offshore to reinforce the Marines and began shelling the Tripolitans into oblivion. With his army routed, his capital under siege, and his only other major port city under enemy control, Yusuf Karamanali decided it was time to seek terms. On the 10th of June 1805, a peace treaty was signed between the Tripolitan Regency and the United States. All American citizens and property was to be immediately returned to the US Navy offshore. In exchange to cover miscellaneous damages as well as to save face, the Congress authorized payment of $60,000 to completely settle the entire affair, on the understanding that such shenanigans shall never take place again. Now, some of you may be wondering why the US should pay them. And indeed, William Eaton asked the exact same question, given all he'd done in taking Derna. Not to mention the fact that he gave his word to Hamid that he'd put him on the throne. But the reality is, war, especially a naval war, especially a blockade, is expensive. And quite frankly, this was the geopolitical equivalent of turning around and saying, I will give you $20 to f*** off. Although, as we know, the United States is not always so circumspect.
Tomahawks? Joke of it is, those things cost like $1.5 million each. We could probably buy the town and every motherfucker in it for less.
Shit, you pay me half that, I'll hump in some seafood and blow this shit on my own damn self.
Besides, with Napoleon's nonsense going down on the continent, there was a good chance that other more pressing issues would arise. But there was a problem with this solution. That being that it only applied to Tripoli. And once the US Navy fell back to deal with more pressing concerns, the other Barbary states, led by Algeria, resumed piracy activities in the Mediterranean. They ran rampant for a number of years as everyone was too busy with the Napoleonic Wars going on to worry about their activities. But by the year 1815, Napoleon had lost the wars of the coalitions and failed his grand European comeback tour at Waterloo, which meant everyone now had massive militaries with nothing to do. The Barbary pirates, however, failed to read the geopolitical situation and kept attacking merchant shipping. Eventually, after one too many American ships were seized by the Algerians, President James Madison, best friend and confidant of Thomas Jefferson, appealed to Congress with a simple proposition. It was time to end this nonsense once and for all, and they had just the man to do it. A 10-ship squadron under the command of now Commodore Decatur sailed into the Mediterranean, seizing every pirate vessel they encountered, among them Algeria's flagship, the Mashuda. They then parked off the coast of the capital city Algiers with a simple demand. The piracy would stop. All tribute will stop. All American persons and property will be returned. You will pay reparations for all damages caused, and if you so much as look at one of our boats again, so help me God, your regency will be terminated with extreme prejudice. Not just Algeria, but all the Barbary states realized that the writing was on the wall. These guys were no longer colonial upstarts. They were a heavily armed and exceptionally angry imperialist power. And much like their large trading fleet and global capitalist ventures suggested, they meant serious business. This event, termed the Second Barbary War, lasted a grand total of 48 hours. The pirates surrendered immediately, agreeing to every condition, signing a treaty guaranteeing the safety of all American vessels in the Mediterranean. Yet there remains a serious question. Why didn't they just do all this in the first place? The whole fleet was there during the First War in 1805. Surely they could have done this then. What took them so long? The US stayed neutral during the Napoleonic Wars. What was the US Navy doing for the 10 years in between? Well... Now, by some big shuck-style quick maths, I'm sure you've worked out by the dates that I laid out in the previous chapter that this was indeed the big issue for America between the Barbary Wars. But the funny thing is, beyond the famous rocket's red glare and the perfectly understandable cultural tradition of saying England, especially after they burned down the White House, practically nobody really knows or cares to know anything about the War of 1812. On the one hand, you have the absolutely titanic Napoleonic Wars going on over in Europe, while just a couple decades later, the next big party, supposedly over states' rights, is standing over there looking all sexy, with its grand speeches, epic battles, and complex human drama, waging a fight to the death over the soul of America, whether it truly is the land of the free or a land of slavery. Compared to all of that, the War of 1812 is, as far as the world, or even as Americans are concerned, a historical footnote. But, if you will allow me to indulge myself for this chapter, it was one of those truly epic Oxford referencing level footnotes. Basically, the situation was this. America had officially declared neutrality in the Napoleonic Wars because that was absolutely no business of theirs. They've already bought Louisiana off the French, and Spain is too weak to worry about given they've got big enough problems at home. This culminated in the knock-on effect that seeing as Europe was fighting what amounted to the 19th century equivalent of a world war, everyone else was focusing on military spending, strategic maneuvering, and sinking everyone else's trading vessels rather than their own economic development. Meaning the United States rapidly developed the largest trading fleet and the biggest commercial sector in the entire Western world, making a fat profit off of everyone involved in the conflict. However, I am sure you can see the issue with that state of affairs. Making money at the expense of everyone means you have to be trading with everyone. And when the Royal Navy sees American trading ships docking at French ports, allowing Napoleon to circumvent their blockades, that makes them a tiny bit apoplectically furious. Yet somehow it got even worse. Due to the rapid increase of demand and the shortfalls in the American labour market for sailors, US companies started hiring British and Canadian sailors to crew their vessels. This cost the Royal Navy some of their best personnel, who, realising the pay is way better in the private sector, quite literally jumped ship. I wonder where we've seen that before. There are also tons of other small factors, such as British colonial Canada supplying arms and finances to the Native Americans, who had collectively decided that the Western settlers could rightfully manifest these nuts, while the Congress and the US public were envious of Canadian territories, many of which had rare metals, exotic furs, and high-quality timber for the taking. And of course there was the aforementioned England mentality, which had been exacerbated by a number of serious diplomatic incidents, the gravest of which being, say the line with me, touching their boats. A lot. The first major boat-touching incident among these was the Chesapeake Leopard affair of 1807, which went a little something like this. USS Chesapeake had been recently refitted at the Washington Navy Yards and she needed a new crew. While recruiting at the various port cities in the area, a number of British sailors signed contracts for a term of service. The issue is, some of those crew members had been reported as deserters by British officers on shore leave, and they had been reported to the commanding officer of the East Coast shipyards and armories, one Stephen Decatur. That's right, man's been moving up in the world. But before he could do anything about it or send a warning to the captain, USS Chesapeake set sail on her scheduled deployment to the Mediterranean. The Royal Navy commander in the region was outraged and immediately sent his task force from Halifax, Nova Scotia, to hunt down and stop any American vessel they found in the area in search for deserters. And as fate would have it, HMS Leopard, fourth-rate ship of the line, ran headlong into USS Chesapeake. HMS Leopard completely outgunned her American opponent, who at the time was in no condition to fight, having done no training workups and was still in the middle of transferring stores to the cargo hold. After the Americans failed to yield to hails and a warning shot, the British opened fire, killing 4 men and wounding 17 others, while closing to boarding range. Royal Marines stormed the vessel, holding the US sailors at gunpoint while they searched for the deserters. Eventually, they found them and dragged the guilty parties aboard HMS Leopard. This done, they released the USS Chesapeake and set sail back to port. This rightfully caused tremendous outrage in the United States, especially because several of the deserters were American citizens who had signed contracts with the Royal Navy, and while they were subject to British law, the punishment for desertion is too extreme to allow a foreign government to handle it. This incidentally saved their lives, as the British deserters were all hanged. But the Chesapeake incident was only the first in a long line of grievances, and it also set the precedent going forward for Royal Navy activities in the region. For the next several years, the Royal Navy would repeatedly intercept US vessels looking for British citizens. If they found British sailors aboard a US vessel, they would forcibly impress them into service with the Royal Navy to do his duty for king and country against that Corsican devil Boney and his grand army. This, of course, led to more than one stand-up gunfight, as well as financial losses in the millions due to delays, loss of cargo, voided sailor contracts, but above all, it was, once again, the principle of the thing. Our former oppressor interfering with and outright attacking American trade, and then, they did it again. Those absolute morons in Whitehall made the same mistake they made last time. Not content with shooting at Americans, not content with touching their boats, they touched their money as well. God, it's like England breeds stupid. The British government, in an effort to clamp down on trade with continental Europe, while also raising money for their war effort against Napoleon, passed every regulation, tariff, and tax imaginable for all friendly and neutral merchant traffic in the region. Friendly and neutral. They passed it for everybody. Tariffs are stupid. They've always been stupid. Why are people so stupid? This went so far as each individual ship having to dock in Britain first to pay for a trade license at extortionate cost before being permitted to sail to Europe, regardless if the nation they're trading to is involved in the conflict or not. And if this was not done, the Royal Navy reserved the right to search and seize any vessel found in violation of these regulations. Furthermore, in order to uphold treaty obligations made with the various Native American confederacies during the American Revolutionary War, the Canadian colonial government began actively funding and supporting attacks on the American settler colonies on the western frontiers, which led to an incredible firestorm in the political landscape of the United States, one that threatened to explode into sectarian violence. One of the major divides was between the Federalists, led by Alexander Hamilton, and the Democratic Republicans, aka the Jeffersonians. The conservative Federalists wanted to strengthen a central government and, federalize power. Wow, almost though it's in the name. This, combined with their big focus on preserving English values, meant they were strongly in favour of supporting Britain in her war against Napoleon, who they, rightfully, viewed as a dictator. The Jeffersonians, on the other hand, as you can probably guess, stuck to their party line, that being, fuck England. Again, rightfully so. American politics divided on foreign conflicts based in existential morality. Almost makes you feel nostalgic, doesn't it? For the record, I'm with the Jeffersonians on this one. Napoleonic France may not be ideal, but never, ever kowtow to Britain. In any case, this exacerbated an already tense situation. In response to all these laws, the Congress passed reactionary tariffs and trade regulations right back at them, almost as though tariffs are dumb, while simultaneously authorizing the Navy to take any action necessary to enforce them. The whole situation was one gigantic, catastrophic mess. Americans were furious over Britain's constant affronts to their national sovereignty and the undermining of their business interests. The settlers were furious over Native Americans now having their own Second Amendment rights to defend their property. The top 1% were furious because in 1807, Britain banned slave trading, leading to them seizing their workforce en route for delivery a full year before the US importation ban began. And Congress was furious with each other, which, to be honest, is situation normal, but I needed to round out this paragraph and this joke. Essentially, the entire North American continent was a powder keg. All it needed was a spark. And behold, the spark. HMS Little Belt, a Royal Navy sloop. She was patrolling off the North Carolina coastline for American ships to search for deserters. In fact, another British ship, the HMS Guerriere, had boarded the USS Spitfire off the coast of New Jersey and impressed an American sailor into the Royal Navy. To stop this activity, the US Navy sortied several frigates into the Atlantic, one of them being the USS President. And on May 16, 1811, President found HMS Little Belt and ordered her to halt. The captain of Little Belt, upholding the honour of his service, refused. This was a brave move, given that USS President was 3 times the size of his own ship. Now, in true propaganda fashion, both sides blame the other for the first shot, and of course the entire incident to begin with. But what is beyond dispute is that HMS Little Belt fired at USS President, who in return completely obliterated their gun deck, essentially disarming them while killing 11 men and wounding 22 more. Insults were flung across the Atlantic, back and forth, with considerable fury. The aforementioned activities continued to escalate in severity. The British Prime Minister got assassinated, sending the House of Commons into turmoil. Wham, bam, thank you ma'am, everything goes to hell. James Madison goes to Congress, screams "F*** England," and Congress agrees. Well, the Democratic Republicans agree. None of the Federalists voted in favour, but they were outvoted. Thus, on June 18th, 1812, the United States declares war on Great Britain, and everything immediately goes wrong. Absolutely no one was prepared for this war. The British were busy with Napoleon. America maintained a small military for frontier security and commerce protection at sea. They had nothing even close to the British Empire. The Native Americans, meanwhile, were always ready for a fight, especially given they were currently getting genocided, except they were also fragmented along tribal lines. And Canada was, well, Canada. Practically everyone on both sides of the Atlantic thought that this whole thing would, as the tired old refrain goes, be over by Christmas. But like every war in history, it never goes to the script. Ironically, after the assassination of the British Prime Minister, the first acts of Parliament were to try and de-escalate tensions with the Americans by repealing all of the tariffs and tax laws levied on US trade. However, the same week the repeals were approved by the House of Lords, the United States declaration of war arrived, and as a matter of honour, they couldn't just sweep it under the rug. Nevertheless, with Napoleon still running rampant, the British decided to adopt a defensive posture. They didn't have the troops in country to do anything serious, and reinforcements would take too much time to arrive. This turned out to be the correct call, as the Americans, seeing an opportunity, decided to strike while the iron was hot and invade Canada. It didn't go well. Essentially, the leader of the US troops, General William Hull, governor of Michigan, marched into the territory of Ontario with this message.
Congratulations, you are being rescued. Please do not resist.
Hoping that the oppressed masses of the Great White North would rise up and throw off the British yoke. They didn't. Turns out, signing treaties with and arming the indigenous Canadians to fight off just such American colonizers makes for useful allies, not to mention that a lot of the newly arrived Canadian citizens settling throughout the region were loyalists who had left after the Revolution. Instead of a triumphant annexation, all the Americans got was excessive amounts of powder and shot flung in their direction. Not to mention a few ambushes that led to total massacres carried out by the various tribes of the region, the biggest of which being done by the Potawatomi tribe at Fort Dearborn, in what is now downtown Chicago. Basically, every time the US troops tried to move or conduct any operations at all, they were met with ferocious resistance. This led to orders being given for a general withdrawal to regroup and rethink. Check our strategy so we can try again later. Believing that the British forces in the region had to be far larger than intel suggested, otherwise they wouldn't be having this trouble. In fact, Major General Isaac Brock only had about 1,500 men compared to the Americans' 4,000, and he was confused as to what the hell they were doing. But, seeing an opportunity, he decided that if the enemy was going to run away, it's only sporting in good British conduct that he should chase them, launching a counter-offensive leading to the siege of Fort Detroit. In perfect good order and with the support of a pair of light Royal Navy ships, he carried out a textbook combined arms assault with artillery and naval gunfire supporting a perfectly timed infantry attack. An attack supported by a native contingent led by the famous Chief Tecumseh, Chief of the Shawnee, the same man where a certain anti-treason pyromaniac gets his middle name from. Fearing they'd be overrun and slaughtered by these Native American auxiliaries, who under Tecumseh's command would have done nothing of the kind, but we all know the era's racism, General Hull ordered the fort surrender without further resistance to spare the lives of his men. He would actually be court-martialed for this by Congress as a coward, but James Madison pardoned him. In any case, the result was the same. The British now controlled the waterways as well as all the major forts in the northern frontiers. With this unexpected seizure of the initiative, preparations were made to begin an advance into New York State. However, thanks to the heroics of some local militiamen and some off-duty US Navy sailors, the Americans managed to capture two of the Royal Navy warships patrolling the Great Lakes, HMS Detroit and HMS Caledonia. With all the information available, General Brock drew the conclusion that he would have to defend the various river crossings into Canada, as enemy maneuvers were very obviously underway to retake the initiative. His assessment was spot on. The Americans, having regrouped, planned a four-pronged assault into Canada to overwhelm and crush the British forces, thereby claiming glorious victory for the Republic and establishing the entire North American continent under congressional authority. What actually happened was on October 13, 1812, the Americans attempted an amphibious assault across the river at Queenstown, just upriver from the famous Niagara Falls, straight into Isaac Brock's main defensive line. Half the assault was swept downriver by the raging current, while the others that made it were mercilessly gunned down by the professional redcoats in an action reminiscent of the one-sided victories earlier on in the Revolution. It was only due to their superior numbers and the fact that they'd gotten a lucky shot killing General Brock that the Americans managed to get a foothold across the river. But before they could secure a bridgehead and start digging in, British reinforcements arrived under a General Sheaffe, who immediately attacked in force. It was a hopeless situation. With half their boats washed away by the current, half the army on the other side of the river, and no heavy fire support thanks to rather exceptional counter-battery fire by the British artillery, Colonel Winfield Scott, leader of the assault contingent, was compelled to surrender his entire force, later being traded during a prisoner exchange. This ended the first attempted US invasion of Canada, devastating both political support for the war and overall public morale. Thankfully, though, while the army had led the nation to disaster, the United States Navy would come to the rescue. At 2 p.m. on August 19, 1812, USS Constitution was carving through the waves at full sail off the shores of Nova Scotia. She had broken contact with a superior force and was now on the prowl for any lone vessels she could pick off. It was then on the horizon a large ship came into view. Proudly fluttering atop its masthead flew the red ensign of the Royal Navy. HMS Guerrière, a frigate captured from the French Navy, saw the Americans at the exact same time they saw her, and both sides immediately turned towards one another to commit to battle. The first exchange of fire was at extreme range and didn't really amount to much. The swell was high and the wind messed with everyone's aim. Both ships were making aggressive moves, jostling for position, edging ever closer to effective range. It was then first blood was drawn, as HMS Guerrière turned to fire a broadside. Only it didn't draw blood. The cannonballs hit the hull on the main structural beams at an acute angle, ricocheting off into the water, doing no damage to Constitution whatsoever. It was at this moment that a legend was born, as one of the sailors aboard allegedly cried at the top of his voice, "Huzzah! Her sides are made of iron!" Constitution had her name, Old Ironsides. And with a powerful moniker like that, she got something else. Main character energy. The Limeys didn't stand a chance. Constitution turned into close with the enemy, with Captain Isaac Hull ordering full sail in the middle of a firefight like an absolute madman to close into point-blank range, and once she had the broadside, chaos reigned. The Americans, realizing that their fleet would almost certainly be outnumbered by European navies, ironically adopted the same strategic force composition that Imperial Japan would adopt a century later against them. Funnily enough, it's also something the Confederates would adopt, but we'll talk about that later. Simply put, if we can't outproduce our enemies, we will make our ships so powerful they can defeat anything they can't outrun, or outrun anything they can't defeat. USS Constitution, though being a similar class of vessel, was much sturdier and far more heavily armed. Old Ironsides tore HMS Guerrière apart, her cannons completely obliterating the foremast and the main gun deck of the British ship, while shrugging off everything fired back. It was then the damaged foremast aboard Guerrière fell overboard into the water, with the rigging still tied to the rest of the superstructure. This acted both as an anchor and a rudder, hauling the Royal Navy ship out of her optimal firing arc. Seeing an opportunity, Constitution crossed the T in front of her and fired a broadside right down the length of the ship with raking fire, killing 10 men in a single blast. But in making that move, they had cut it too close, and the two ships collided with a crash, with the bowsprit and the prow wedged into Old Ironsides' rigging. Boarding parties exchanged musket fire, but the seas were far too rough to attempt a boarding action over what amounted to a balancing beam crossed with a tightrope. Even as this was going on, though, Constitution's guns were still able to engage and kept pummeling the enemy at literal knife-fighting range, cutting through the supports for HMS Guerrière's mainmast. Eventually, through some outstanding seamanship, the Americans managed to break their vessel free and fired yet another broadside into the now burning ship, before turning to get some distance and reload for a stand-up fight to the finish. However, this would prove to be unnecessary. As they turned around, guns at the ready, the sight that greeted them sent cheers ringing throughout the ship. All of HMS Guerrière's masts had fallen to the deck, their sails dragging in the water behind them. Their hull was wrecked from bow to stern, as the prow had been snapped in half when old Ironsides had broken free. Cautiously approaching the doomed ship, a single cannon fired on the other side of the vessel, as the Royal Navy ensign dragged over the stern. Interpreting this as a sign of surrender, Captain Isaac Hull sent his lieutenant over to parley with the British captain, coming aboard and seeing the carnage that they had wrought. The lieutenant found Captain Darkres and asked if he intended to surrender. With a wry smile and in true British humour, he responded with the following. "Well, sir, I don't know. Our mizzenmast is gone, our fore and mainmasts are gone. I think, on the whole, you might say we have struck our flag." The battle was over, a decisive victory to the Americans. Wanting to take the Guerrière as a prize, they attempted to rig up a tow, but the ship was well beyond saving. Constitution, meanwhile, had survived with relatively no damage, except for a perfectly placed cannonball wedged in the foremast that hadn't gone through. Even so, they now had over 250 prisoners aboard, which obviously couldn't come on their full war patrol. Thus, Captain Hull ordered Constitution to make full speed for Boston, pulling into port 10 days later. The boost to American morale and patriotism at this victory cannot be overstated. After the disastrous events on the northern border, the United States Navy had beaten the finest fleet on the seas in a man-to-man showdown. And while it had little to no overall military significance, it is widely considered that this was the first truly definitive moment in the history of the United States Navy. Yet there was a serious issue. Old Ironsides had attempted to steal the title of main character from the main character. And this simply would not do. Having grown incredibly bored of managing shipyards and desperate to get back out there now that there was a war on, the moment war broke out with Great Britain, Commodore Stephen Decatur transferred his flag to an appropriately named ship, the USS United States, and then set sail to join Commodore John Rogers, who was assembling a task force in New York Harbor to go hunting Royal Navy ships in the Atlantic. After conducting a coastal sweep to ensure that the British weren't planning a decisive battle right out the gate, the various frigates of the United States Navy sailed forth into the open seas on the hunt for prey, and Stephen Decatur, in keeping with his style, was one of the furthest reaching aboard USS United States, ranging as far as a day's sailing from the British west coast, much in the spirit of John Paul Jones. He didn't have much luck immediately. For their entire patrol, they only captured one light vessel, a ship named the Mandarin. The rest of the time, they spent scanning the horizon, seeing practically no one. On a hunch, desperately wanting to get to grips directly with the enemy, Commodore Decatur started hunting in the vicinity of the Azores. They were the only real forward base for the Royal Navy in the Atlantic proper, due to their alliance with Portugal. Sure enough, after a day or two, the recognisable shape of a British warship was spotted in the distance, and they were moving on a reciprocal bearing. In a twist of irony, the ship they'd found was the HMS Macedonian, who, prior to the current unpleasantness, had often been berthed next to the USS United States in the naval yards. In fact, the captain of Macedonian had wagered his beaver fur cap to the previous commander of the United States that should they ever meet on the field of honour, or rather the ways of honour, that HMS Macedonian would vanquish them in battle. However, I'm sure you can see the flaw in his reasoning. I'm not sure of the calibre of the former captain, but I can guarantee you that his calculus of the balance of combat power did not factor in Commodore Stephen Decatur. who, after analysing the tactical situation, drew the conclusion that given his ship's superiority in long-range firepower, a battery of no less than 30 24-pounder long guns, and given that he was in a ship called the United States, he had to uphold the national image. You know what? I'm just going to shoot him. HMS Macedonian was engaged at range well outside of her ability to effectively return fire. Yet against all the odds, she managed to hit a lucky shot on one of the beams supporting the rigging, which in an absolute 1 in a million shot sent a large wooden splinter flying right into Stephen Decatur's chest. For a split second, it appeared that Captain Carden would get to keep his hat. Except he was shooting at Stephen Decatur, who is the main character. And thus, he pulled the splinter out of his chest, padded the wound, and then directed a precision broadside back at them, which knocked down Macedonian's rear mast in one shot. It was as if United States took offense at someone trying to kill her captain, because the volume of firepower that hit the Royal Navy that day was like something out of Exodus. The Americans pummeled their adversary into submission, blowing the masts down, killing or wounding over 100 of the crew, splintering every single deck and blasting away every single gun. When USS United States turned broadside at close range to deliver a final blow, a hail rang out demanding the British surrender, and Captain Carden complied. Rather wisely, I think. Now, you would take into consideration, with the large amount of damage being similar to HMS Guerriere, that the Americans would simply take prisoners, sink the ship, and then carry on their war patrol. But no. Stephen Decatur is the main character. And while he loved the USS Constitution, it was his first commander's captain after all, he loved winning more. Thus, he did the only logical thing. He spent the rest of the time allocated for his patrol fixing Macedonian so he could tow it and its crew back to New York in triumph. And he did exactly that. The newly christened USS Macedonian, after being re-equipped and repainted, served with honor and distinction in the US Navy throughout the War of 1812 and for close to a decade after, while Stephen Decatur will continue to wage war on America's enemies with his usual dash and daring. He really deserves a video entirely to himself, but suffice to say, throughout the remainder of the conflict he engaged in numerous shenanigans. Among them blockade running, being cornered by the enemy, a desperate battle followed by a razor-thin escape, real swashbuckling Pirates of the Caribbean type stuff. Though eventually the British caught him and shipped him to Bermuda, where funnily enough, they treated him like a celebrity and conquering hero. Yet his astonishing career and his crazy exploits serve as a perfect foil to describe everything that the War of 1812 wasn't. Because despite the heroics I've described thus far from both sides, and there were certainly more we shall discuss, it must be said that this whole war was entirely pointless. For the next 2 years, both sides repeatedly tried to invade the other. America would invade Canada, only to get stopped and then repulsed. Then the British would counterattack into Michigan or Ohio, crossing a river or attacking a fort, only to again get stopped and then subsequently repulsed. In a rather odd way, it was similar to the ongoing conflict in Ukraine today. Decisive battles heralded on the news weren't grand contests of arms that defined the destiny of continents that we would see later. Rather, they were defined by a small unit of men who would capture a town or a fort, while the opposing force would seize a trading post connected to a tactically significant river crossing. In response to that, the first unit would attack the trading post across a nearby bridge, and a stalemate would result as both sides jockey for position, etc., etc., etc. The only real serious movement on the tactical and strategic level was the American campaign against the various Native American groups in the west of the country and against Tecumseh's Confederacy, who had eventually suffered defeat after Tecumseh himself died heroically in brutal hand-to-hand combat, facing down a ferocious American bayonet charge at the Battle of the Thames River in Ontario, earning him respect and admiration on both sides for his bravery. Sadly, though, in a tale depressingly familiar for every generation before or since, a lot of good men were dying for a dubious cause of little to no purpose. But the reality was, despite the United States having been born by prevailing over the British, times had changed. This time they were on their own, and the Britain they were fighting was fully militarized, well-led, and even though they were distracted by Napoleon, they were easily the American superior. Even considering the fact that the front lines hadn't moved all that much, and the heroics of the US Navy's best sailors, the Royal Navy and the Redcoats had won almost every other battle fought, and sooner or later, they would get backup from extremely well-trained veteran troops. If the US was to stay in this fight, it would have to take a decisive offensive move to seize the initiative and win an earth-shattering victory to stave off disaster. It was then another American hero stepped up to the plate. A man we have met before in this video. A man willing to charge into the breach against all odds and overcome the impossible. Captain Oliver Hazard Perry. Throughout 1813, the British had been consolidating their control over the Great Lakes while strengthening their foothold in Michigan. On the southern shores, the surviving US Navy ships were blockaded at their moorings, while the militiamen manning the border forts had a shortage of both experience and equipment. The reality was, things were rather desperate. With the enemy controlling the Great Lakes and a strong fortification in the city of Detroit, they could funnel an entire invasion force into the Midwest, linking up with their Native American allies, and then there would be hell to pay. Again, the only thing keeping the US in this fight is the British being forced to fight 2 intercontinental wars at the same time and not having enough support. Yet. But the newly appointed commander of the forces on Lake Erie, now Master Commandant Oliver Hazard Perry, had been sent to turn the situation around. On the Isthmus of Presque Isle outside the city of Erie itself, construction had begun on a number of brig-class vessels whose ultimate purpose was to wrest control of the Great Lakes away from the Royal Navy, giving US forces the naval support they need to retake Detroit and turn the war around. Except even with these new ships, it would still not be enough to overcome the British task force that was at that very moment trading shots with the shore batteries set up to protect the shipyards from attack. But of course, they're dealing with Oliver Hazard Perry. And Oliver Hazard Perry has a plan. He always has a plan. It was an absolutely batshit plan, but it was indeed a plan. First, he needed to get more boats. So where is he going to get them? Well, the British had been forced to abandon their forts guarding the entrance to the Niagara River due to their defeat at the Battle of Fort George on Lake Ontario, which was a textbook example of American combat doctrine. Plans are useless, but planning is essential. And when all else fails, embrace the chaos and improvise. If we don't know what we're doing, the enemy sure as hell doesn't. They launched a complex 3-pronged amphibious assault with timed intervals between attacks, complete with integrated fire support from the US Navy gunboats. And when the British counterattacked the landing force, which actually involved Winfield Scott himself fighting off redcoats with his sword, they improvised a fire plan with grape shot from the gunboats while organising a flanking manoeuvre that forced the entire British force on the opposite bank of the Niagara River to withdraw in full. And who planned that amphibious assault? And commanded the gunboats? And commanded the artillery? That would be Oliver Hazard Perry. So he knows what he's doing, and he knows where to get some more boats. Problem. They are all on Lake Ontario, or in the harbour at Black Rock near Buffalo, New York. So how Will he get the boats? Well, it was really quite simple. He rode over there on his horse with a work gang, rounded up the local draft animals, which were mainly oxen, and towed his entire old flotilla up the Niagara River from the riverbank. He then waited for some shitty weather to give them cover, so he could then sail them along the shoreline to the Presque Isle shipyards without getting spotted. With that done, they then had another issue. We have all these ships, but we don't have any guns to equip them with, or even any crew to man them. This is, as they say, suboptimal. Not to worry though, because the US military has a tried and tested solution, one might even call it a tradition, to deal with such problems. Tactical equipment acquisition, and finding a private not doing anything. And as luck would have it, an American infantry unit had come into possession of a batch of British heavy 24-pounder guns destined for Fort Detroit, and they had acquired them through some very aggressive business negotiations, while the crew of USS Constitution was on shore leave for refit after her aforementioned adventures the previous year. Then there was the garrison of the shore batteries and the coastal forts near Erie City, many of whom were tradesmen or fishermen in civilian life. There is a reason why the hypothetical, fictional, completely made-up organization known as the E4 Mafia carries clipboards everywhere. If you don't look busy, you could just get detailed to do something, which in this case is taking on the Royal Navy in open battle with scratch crews, new build ships, no training, and armed with whatever we can find and absolutely no plan. Wonderful. But that's okay. Oliver Hazard Perry has a plan. And nevertheless, by July 29th, 1813, they had gotten their vessels armed and crewed, the new lead ship being named USS Lawrence after the slain captain of USS Chesapeake, a dear friend of Oliver Hazard Perry. So much so that when discussions were had about what the signal to commence battle should be, Perry suggested that a flag bearing James Lawrence's last words would be the most appropriate, a motto that would live in US Navy legend. It simply read, "Don't give up the ship." Now, before we go any further, I'm sure you're wondering, how did the Americans manage to do all of that without being stopped? Shore batteries haven't exactly stopped the Royal Navy from blasting enemy fleets in port before. I don't actually know if you were wondering that, but I needed a transition into the last piece of this ramshackle romp through US Navy improvisation, because at the mouth of the Presque Isle Inlet is a sandbar which blocks any ship larger than a fishing barge from entering or leaving the harbour, meaning that all the British could do is blockade them. And unlike a siege, the blockaders are the ones who have to watch their supplies. And by the end of July, their reserves were low. They didn't have enough ships to maintain the blockade indefinitely, and worse still, there was a massive summer rainstorm rolling in, with winds so strong they could capsize them. So they headed back to Detroit to rearm, resupply, and reorganize, to get ready to continue hostilities in better conditions. This was what Perry was waiting for. While the British were gone, he stripped his brand new ships of all their equipment to get them as light in the water as possible. He then rallied the crews and dragged them over the sandbar mid-storm using floating barges to lift the ships while the men manned small craft around them and pulled for their lives. By the time the Royal Navy returned, the entire US squadron in the Great Lakes region was armed and ready. Or at least it looked that way. The brigs and the heavy gunboats actually still didn't have their weapons aboard, but being the man that he is, Oliver Hazard Perry did the naval equivalent of T-posing to assert dominance. Commander Barclay of His Majesty's Most Illustrious Royal Navy bravely ran away back to Detroit, where a new heavy sloop, creatively named Detroit, was being built to offset the changing balance of power. Seeing this opportunity, the Americans moved their base of operation to Put-in Bay, Ohio, which, if you check this handy-dandy map, is right across from Detroit. Alas, how the turntables, my limey friends! It is now you whom stis blockaded. And so, the staring contest began. Throughout the month of August, both sides worked steadily away, improving their ships, working up the crews, getting ready for the fight everyone knew was coming. Then, on September 10th, 1813, the lookouts observing the opposite shores saw the British ships at full sail, forming up into line of battle. Perry raised the flag bearing the words, "Don't give up the ship," and gave the order to reciprocate. The decisive showdown for the control of Lake Erie was upon them. The British opened the battle with accurate long-range fire from HMS Detroit, concentrating on Perry's flagship, the Lawrence. They had the winds in their favour, while the Americans were struggling even at full sail. By the time the American line got within range, the flagship had already taken significant damage, meaning that when they returned fire, the effect was less than stellar. Worse still, the USS Caledonia was blocking USS Niagara's shot against HMS Queen Charlotte, meaning the other two ships of the line in this battle couldn't engage each other and were forced to fire on other targets. The British naturally choosing the biggest target, USS Lawrence. Commandant Perry desperately tried to save his flagship, firing every cannon and musket aboard in defiance, but she just couldn't stand up to the devastating barrage being inflicted upon her. Realizing this fact, Oliver Hazard Perry retrieved the battle standard bearing his friend's last words with a solemn promise that while he was forced to abandon ship, he would not leave her to the enemy's mercy. As God as his witness, they would prevail. He then, in full view of the British fleet and under heavy fire, boarded a whaler and rowed down the battle line to transfer his flag to USS Niagara. As he did this, one of the first African-American heroes of the United States Navy, a freedman named Cyrus Tiffany, who served as Oliver Hazard Perry's batman, shielded his officer from enemy fire during the crossing, an effort which he succeeded in, as Perry assumed command of the Niagara and continued the battle. Yet even though it seemed that the British were winning, their focused destruction of USS Lawrence came at a cost. By concentrating their fire on the flagship, they weren't suppressing or disrupting the other American ships in the battle line. And if you recall, those other ships were in possession of some rather hefty artillery, courtesy of the men now shooting at them. It seemed only fitting that they should return their borrowed items as fast as possible, with interest. The gunboats down the US Navy line of battle pummeled Detroit and Queen Charlotte with devastating effect, raking them up and down with accurate broadsides. Under such heavy fire and being forced to evade the now listing hulk of the abandoned USS Lawrence, HMS Detroit swerved violently out of line. HMS Queen Charlotte, under the same amount of fire, had lost both her captain and her first lieutenant, leaving an inexperienced junior officer at the con. The two collided with a tremendous crash, wedging them hopelessly together, their rigging tangled and sails ripped to shreds. At this moment, despite all the odds, despite the tides of battle and the very tides themselves, Oliver Hazard Perry saw his chance, and he took it. Watching on in disbelief, Commander Barclay, expecting the Americans to withdraw at the loss of their flagship, instead saw USS Niagara raise her signal flags, ordering the flotilla into tight formation, turn hard to starboard, and charge straight through the middle of the British battle line, all guns blazing. At that moment, as the very course of history hung tenuously in the balance, the pendulum finally swung. The Royal Navy Great Lakes Flotilla was doomed. The Americans had seized the initiative and refused to let go. They surrounded the two heavy sloops and blasted them with everything they had, reducing them to floating hulks of scrap. The other British ships tried to make a run for it, but the wind that had aided them in the attack now cursed them in their escape. The lighter gunboats of the American force chased them down without mercy. By the end of the day, every single Royal Navy ship on the waters of Lake Erie had struck their colours in surrender. And in a final act of supreme savagery, Commandant Oliver Hazard Perry transferred his flag back to USS Lawrence to officially offer Commander Barclay his terms. Terms which were, of course, unconditional surrender. Severely wounded and out of options, Barclay surrendered his force in its entirety that same evening. The Battle of Lake Erie, what would ultimately become the decisive battle of the war, was over. With this done, Oliver Hazard Perry sent a report to the commander ashore, which simply read, "Dear General, we have met the enemy, and they are ours. 2 ships, 2 brigs, 1 schooner, and 1 sloop. Yours with great respect and esteem, O. H. Perry." With their victory over the Royal Navy on Lake Erie, the United States held the initiative in the Western Theater. In time, they would recapture Fort Detroit and the Niagara Peninsula, along with the entire state of Michigan, while British efforts to invade Ohio and Pennsylvania were curtailed once and for all. The final nail in the coffin, however, came at the Battle of Lake Champlain, where the mighty USS Saratoga, second of her name, and her sister Ticonderoga crushed a flotilla supporting the British Army marching on Plattsburgh, New York, who were forced to abandon their attack as a result, leaving the entire frontier in a bitter stalemate. But as everyone in this audience is almost certainly aware, the War of 1812 is famous for one singular event above all others. An event which formed the closing act of a drama that defined both nations on the North American continent in a small, yet such a historically poignant way that I would be remiss if I left it out. So let us end this chapter of our story in the only way it should be ended. A chapter I will read to you in the eerie light of the rocket's red glare. The year is 1814. The April sun is melting the last remnants of the winter snows, the snows of yesteryear gone from this earth. And much like those snows, Napoleon Bonaparte, Emperor of the French, has abdicated his throne. Europe, after all these years, is finally starting to move towards peace. Granted, he'd have a surprise comeback tour, but that's the thing about surprises. No one knows about that yet. But speaking of surprises, the drawdown of forces on the continent freed up thousands of combat veterans and a veritable armada of ships for use in the Americas. Ergo, surprise butt stuff was coming Washington's way. And for one of the only times in history, quite literally. With this seemingly pointless conflict dragging on, straining the already very stretched resources of the British Empire, calls from Whitehall to swiftly end the conflict were growing louder. Thus, wanting to destroy the power base of the US Navy and decapitate the state institutions of the United States, Admiral John Warren and Rear Admiral George Cockburn planned a campaign in the Chesapeake Bay region with a culminating attack on the centers of American power, namely Washington, D.C. and the city of Baltimore. The difference this time, though, is they now have the assets and combat power available to try it, given that these forces are now being redirected from the Napoleonic Wars. But, even taking that into account, this was a ballsy move. By the very nature of long-range amphibious operations, they couldn't bring their heavier artillery or cavalry units, and the field commanders raised these concerns up the chain. Yet the operational concept was a smash and grab to wreck everything they possibly could of military or civic value, and then boogie on out before the Continental Army 2 Electric Boogaloo could get organized to push them back. So that wasn't much of a concern. It was a good plan, a great plan even. So they decided to try it. On the 19th of August 1814, a task force of Royal Navy warships began their advance up the Potomac River to settle this dispute between nations once and for all. The men at Fort Washington had been alert for British activity, but they had no idea about the sheer wall of iron and shot now sailing towards them. When they made contact, it wasn't even a fight. The British didn't even need to deploy troops, the weight of fire was so heavy. The garrison withdrew, leaving the river undefended, allowing the Royal Marines to come ashore with a regiment of foot practically unopposed, and march on DC itself. Back in the city, there was an atmosphere of sheer panic. Theoretically, and keep in mind, theoretically, the garrison outnumbered the invasion force significantly, but they were almost entirely militia. A small contingent of regulars and US Marines with an attached cavalry squadron were all the professional soldiers available, numbering about 1,000 or so. General William Winder, the commanding officer of the military district, ordered the Washington garrison to muster with everyone they could find and whatever they had available, stripping guns from the Navy Yard, nearby forts, and even the future Naval Academy at Annapolis, called Fort 7 at the time. Whatever they could grab, they grabbed. Pikes, spears, swords, everything. Militia units marched in from all over the nearby countryside, eventually coalescing at the crossroads on a ridgeline just outside the town of Bladensburg, Maryland. From this ridge, they could range guns on the town itself, as well as the nearby river crossings, while controlling the roads to Washington, Baltimore, and Georgetown. It seemed like the best place to be, and looking at the map, I would tend to agree. Except for the part where he divided his force into a layered defense, which he didn't have enough combat power to maintain effectively. He doesn't have many trained soldiers to mutually support and reinforce and act as a reserve. And then he split the few artillery pieces he did have into small support batteries, instead of doing what every other professional army did at the time, which is mass your fire to achieve fire superiority, which you can then use to blast the enemy to pieces. So when the 1,500 men of the professional, battle-hardened Royal Marines and 44th Regiment of Foot, who have spent the last few years murdering Frenchmen, met the 7,000 men of Washington's garrison, they assaulted the Bladensburg Bridge with overwhelming speed and aggression. Faced with this attack, the Americans, instead of holding the enemy at a choke point, massing their superior numbers for a counterattack, and then buying time for reinforcements, instead left their untrained militiamen guarding the bridge completely unsupported, resulting in them being engaged, suppressed, and then flanked by a contingent of redcoats who forded the river completely unopposed, who then cut them to pieces. This handed the battlefield initiative firmly to the invaders, who immediately pressed their advantage, smashing through the second line of defences with the same ruthless efficiency. When the main force entrenched on the ridgeline finally made contact, half their army had already fled the field in disarray, including their supply train, meaning they were now facing some of the best soldiers in the British Army with the most combat experience in the world, with no ammo for their heavy guns. Despite outnumbering their enemy nearly 3-1, entrenched on the high ground overlooking a bridge crossing, the defenders of the United States Capitol were routed from the field. This whole debacle would be called the single worst moment in the history of American arms, immortalized with the scathing moniker, the Bladensburg Races. Washington, D.C. was left undefended, as James Madison and Congress fled the city to preserve the functions of government as well as documents of vital national importance, such as records from the War Department and the historical documents of the Revolution, Declaration of Independence, etc. A few militiamen rallied on the outskirts and tried to engage the advancing enemy, but they were very quickly swept aside. 4,500 British troops entered the US Capitol on August 24th, 1814, and, acting upon their orders, they put the city to the torch. Marching to Capitol Hill, the invaders sacked every government building they came across, the grand prize being the Capitol building itself, then housing the Library of Congress. After looting valuable items and important government documents, they set the building alight. The fire quickly consumed the interior of the building, aided by the over 3,000 volumes in the Congressional Library. But due to the ferocity of the blaze, the British troops couldn't actually amass enough fuel to raise the building entirely before being forced to withdraw. Even so, they had accomplished one of their missions. Though of course, they had one other major target on Pennsylvania Avenue. Marching to the White House, James Madison's wife had already directed the household slaves to evacuate the various valuables along with their luggage. But when the British troops entered the building, they found a very large meal laid out for the officers expected to return from a glorious victory over them. Needless to say, they helped themselves to the buffet before starting another cooking fire of their own. The White House was gutted by flames, the scorch marks from which you can still see today on the older foundation stones. Most of the government buildings in Washington were burned, including the War Department and the Treasury. The entire naval yard was razed to the ground, along with Fort McNair. Eventually, after 26 hours of occupation and wanton destruction, with their mission complete, the British troops boarded the Royal Navy vessels anchored in the Potomac and sailed back down the river. And they had to be quick about it too, because this withdrawal was partially motivated by the arrival of a hurricane, which, despite being hailed as the storm that saved the city in the newspapers, actually did more damage than the British did. These forces linked up with a detachment that had successfully raided the trading port of Alexandria, towing 22 cargo ships full of loot in their wake. This left the British only one objective remaining: the city of Baltimore. But with their battle to take the capital getting blasted by a hurricane, the delays inherent in regrouping, and frankly the time wasted looting, they had given General Winder and the US militias time to rally their forces to the defense and round up some more professional soldiers. The outcome of the war and their bargaining position in upcoming peace negotiations depended on the outcome of this, the final battle. Avoiding the various coastal batteries and harbour forts in the region, the British task force sailed north to the end of the peninsula, snaking east of Baltimore itself, landing troops at North Point, which is on the southern side of the peninsula, facing south. But whatever, I'm from Australia, I'm upside down. To me, this seems perfectly logical. And to be honest, it sure beats landing at the actual northern point on the peninsula, which is up there. And that one is called, I shit you not, Cuckold Point. Yes, really. Could you imagine if the final victory over the American rebellion, launched by the glorious British Army, avenging the shame of the revolution, could you imagine if that was started at Cuck Point? Anyway, the British troops, now assembled, marched up the peninsula as it arches west towards the city. Yet standing at a choke point in the isthmus facing them down was General John Stricker and 5 regiments of the Maryland militia, and unlike at the Battle of Bladensburg, they had made masterful use of the terrain, positioning themselves in between natural barriers, forcing the British to attack their defences head-on across a narrow front, with 2 regiments in reserve to plug any gaps. The battle was fierce, but the Americans, though outnumbered, held their ground, inflicting devastating damage on the invaders. Reserves flexed into position after a British flanking force threatened to turn the line, and when the position became untenable, the entire force executed a textbook fighting withdrawal, with one of their sharpshooters killing the British commanding general, Robert Ross, as they went. This bought critical time for the defensive line at Baltimore to be reinforced and fortified while the British reorganized, though it was a very narrow margin. The Royal Navy advanced down the bay towards Fort McHenry, guarding the entrance to Baltimore Harbor as the army marched towards the city itself. And the next day, on September 13th, the battle began in earnest. The British warships began barraging Fort McHenry to suppress the artillery batteries, paving the way to provide direct support to the infantry assault scheduled to begin later that day. Only the Americans didn't stop shooting back. No matter how many shells the Royal Navy fired, no matter how much damage they did, they just couldn't keep them down. And even though the return fire fell short due to them pulling back out of range, every time the British tried to come in close to support the army, the volume of fire from Fort McHenry forced them away. And without that Royal Navy support, the Redcoats didn't stand a chance in hell, because as the vanguard carried out probing attacks on the American defensive line outside Baltimore, what they found was not the disorganized militia force they'd fought near Washington, nor was it the skirmishing force they'd encountered the day before. What they'd run into was the Continental Army itself. 10,000 regular US Army soldiers and over 100 guns. The various delays throughout the campaign and the delaying action fought by the Maryland militia had given the defenders too much time to get organized. When the assault commenced, they made some initial progress, breaking through on the right flank and gaining some ground, but it was very expensive just to get through the first layer of defenses, and by the time they reached the main redoubt on Hampstead Hill, the British commander, Colonel Arthur Brooke, realized that without naval gunfire support, taking this position would not be possible. As long as Fort McHenry stood firm, their assault was going nowhere, and the longer they stayed, the more reinforcements the Americans would receive. They didn't have the time, supplies, or manpower to carry out a complex attack, and as the sun began to set, it became clear the Royal Navy weren't going to prevail. They tried everything: diversionary landing parties, hit-and-run attacks with the lighter vessels, but the garrison repulsed every single attack, with the last one being seen off with 3 rousing cheers led by the commanding officer, Major Armistead. Accepting the reality of the situation, Colonel Brooke ordered the transport flotilla to weigh anchor and for the army to begin a staged withdrawal. They couldn't order a retreat, because if the Americans saw them running or detect a break in the fire, the entire force would be vulnerable to a fatal counterattack that could potentially result in the wholesale destruction of his command. So the Navy intensified their barrage as the army began to embark, firing every weapon available to draw attention and give the impression that the attack would resume in the morning. Among those weapons were Congreve rockets, relentlessly fired into Fort McHenry and at the troops emplaced around the city, sending streaks of flame and bright explosions radiating over the harbour. And watching from a ship anchored in the Patuxent River nearby was the American poet Francis Scott Key. As the sun rose in the morning, with the Royal Navy vessels withdrawing out of the bay, he looked over at Fort McHenry and saw that the garrison had replaced the tattered shot-through standard that had stood throughout the battle with a hand-stitched flag 5 times the regulation size. Old Glory in her finest grandeur caught the wind off the bay in the proud rising sun and began fluttering in the breeze. Grabbing his pen, he scribbled down on the back of a spare envelope he pulled from his pocket a name for the scene he had beheld. The name he gave it was the Star-Spangled Banner. In the aftermath of this battle, it was apparent that both sides were utterly exhausted while being at a complete impasse militarily. While Britain could almost certainly win the war with the resources it had available, after spending the past decade fighting Napoleon and with no decisive victories to show for their efforts, it was generally considered by the British High Command under the Duke of Wellington that such a campaign would not be worth the blood and treasure required to carry it out. The victories won on Lake Erie and at Plattsburgh, combined with the repulse at Baltimore, put an end to any serious plans to annex the northern United States. The Americans, meanwhile, realized that they couldn't win outright. They were up against the wall, and they knew it. But the whole war had been started over a matter of honor, and with the situation as it was, honor appeared to have been satisfied. But there was one far greater issue at hand that was more important than anything else. Both the United States and Britain were the world's largest mercantile powers. As long as this war was going on, no one was making any money. And with Europe now available for the arrival of this newfangled thing called capitalism, a war in the Atlantic was not good for business. Thus, the Treaty of Ghent was signed on Christmas Eve 1814, to be ratified in February of 1815. Technically the war didn't end there though, as news took time in those days. During this latency period, the British tried to take the city of New Orleans in Louisiana. But you don't need me to tell that story, because besides the fact that other historians that are better than me have already covered it, someone has already wrote a very catchy song about it.
They caught the bloody British in a town in New Orleans. We fired our guns and the British kept a-coming.
What was important, though, was the treaty's stipulations, which were status quo ante. That's right. After all of that, after the drama of the story I just told you, these epic battles, the War of 1812 ended status quo ante, aka right back where we all started. The only difference is now Britain didn't need to impress sailors or pass tariffs because the war with Napoleon was over, which made it really easy for everyone to just sort of let the whole affair go. All of it was quite literally for nothing. Except for the Native Americans who, as usual, got ethnically cleansed and murdered while getting diplomatically screwed by everybody. Britain initially tried to protect their rights and agreements, given it was their treaties which protected them, but America said, please don't, we want to manifest our destiny, and Britain, in keeping with their regular indigenous policies in their own colonies, said, we don't care about them anyway, and went on murdering their own ethnic minorities. So, history marched ever onwards, with America and Britain never having a dispute over Canada ever again. Alright, it's 1859, 40 years later. Manifest Destiny has, well, manifested. Sort of. Some people are upset about the Native Americans being displaced and murdered, but most of the country are more concerned about the fact that people still own people. Especially when almost the entire world has come to the conclusion that if your favourite towel rack is named Frank, and last week you sold his wife and son to your rich friends at the Planters Country Club, you are in fact a gigantic piece of shit. Yet far on the frontiers of the Pacific Northwest, a crisis of geopolitical magnitude, hence unseen, was forming. A flashpoint, the likes of which no man could have foreseen. A battlefield located between the two great jewels of the region. The wonderful city of Seattle, home to some of my dearest friends, a fantastic football club, and the most dangerous mafia organization of the modern age, disguised as an aircraft manufacturer. And opposite them, the city of Vancouver, whose prowess at flinging small black objects across frozen lakes strikes terror into the hearts of men. They're also good at other things, like throwing F-18 Hornets at Russian bombers who want to play high-stakes chicken, and throwing frag grenades at starving German POWs who think they're about to get a tin of corned beef. And sitting in the channel of water between these two great cities are the San Juan Islands. Essentially, like most border conflicts of this nature, it all came about because no one thought they'd get that far, or that two separate countries would even exist to cause issues in the first place. But of course, it didn't pan out that way, and so now there is a vital waterway that forms the backbone of the region's economy on the border of two countries, and right in the middle of that channel of water is a set of islands which, due to various debates over whose map we use, who found it first, who has rights to it, who paid for it, and ultimately who controls the trade lanes through it, no one actually knows who's in charge. However, while there were a few issues here and there, everyone just sort of sailed past without worrying about it. There was money to make and stuff to do. It was then a Canadian company named Hudson's Bay, who mainly dealt in furs and livestock, saw that the main island had great potential for the agricultural arm of the business. They could graze sheep and cows and other livestock on it. As such, they established several farms, the largest of which being used for livestock, run by contractors for the company. I'm sure you can see the issue here. We aren't sure who owns the rights to this place, and we now have people setting up businesses. How's that gonna go when another rights holder shows up? Enter stage left, as usual, American settler colonists, who arrived at a similar time. At first, all went well. The war was almost half a century ago, so there isn't any serious beef. Besides the cows, obviously. Everyone got along reasonably well. No one expected any actual trouble over this little inconsequential line on a map. But then, a man by the name of Lyman Cutler went into his yard one morning and found a pig digging up his potato crop.
Oi! Oi! You pig! Get the hell out of my potatoes!
What are you saying me for? I'm free range! I'm allowed to be here!
Holy shit! The pig talks! Devilry!
Okay, so, an American settler has just shot a Canadian pig on disputed land. But the crucial detail here is that the Canadian pig carried out an act of aggression against the financial assets of a US citizen. And you all know what that means. At first, Lyman Cutler offered one Mr. Charles Griffin, the owner of said pig, $10 compensation for killing his livestock, the equivalent of around $400 today, according to the calculator I used anyway. But as you can imagine, fodder, keeping, time taken to fatten it up, and of course the eventual sale of the pig when it's slaughtered, just think about how much you pay for meat today at the grocery store. That would not cover the financial loss. So Mr. Griffin demanded $100, literally 10 times that amount. Now the American community took umbrage at this, calling it highway robbery, which in fairness, it absolutely was. But the British government insisted that the amount be settled in Griffin's favour. Furthermore, they wanted to place restrictions on more American settlers coming to the island, saying it infringed on their sovereignty. The American community immediately wired their local authorities and explained the situation, relaying the tyranny of their northern neighbours. And action was immediate. Anchors away, the Navy's on its way. USS Massachusetts set sail for the islands carrying a contingent of the US Army's 9th Infantry Regiment, commanded by Captain George Pickett. Yes, that one. Seeing this, the British immediately dispatched 3 warships of their own, anchoring offshore opposite the American positions, their guns trained on Pickett's gun battery and USS Massachusetts. But Captain Pickett wasn't deterred. In his own words, "Don't worry, boys, we will make a regular Bunker Hill of it." Now, if you'll excuse me, I have to break the timeline for a second. Georgie, my boy, my man, my guy. Of all the people to be throwing shade for making hopelessly costly frontal assaults, gonna be real, man, you ain't it. Like, the single dumbest tactical decision in the entire American Civil War is named after you, Chief. I mean, I know you were ordered to do it by overrated E. Lee, but you're the guy who agreed to do it. Anyway, thankfully for everyone concerned, Second Lieutenant Henry Robert pointed out that maybe instead of confronting the Royal Navy and the Royal Marines in open ground outnumbered, we should retreat to our side of the island and maybe build a fort, or some kind of defensive position while the US warship offshore could provide mutual support. Which everyone thought was a great idea. But you know what's a better idea? Backup. Getting backup. Getting backup is a way better idea, and funnily enough, the British had exactly the same thought. Fast forward a couple of days, and this island now has 500 US troops on it on one side, and an entire Royal Navy task force on the other. 5 warships, heavy guns, a regiment of Marines, the works. The two forces take up battle positions. Arms and ammunition are distributed. Standards are raised. Negotiations between the two sides have broken down. All-out war is about to commence. And then, communications from both London and Washington, D.C. arrive. And to paraphrase both messages, they went something along the lines of, "What the actual f*** are you all doing? We are not going to start another war over shooting a pig. Are you all out of your goddamned minds? Eventually, senior officers are dispatched. General Winfield Scott, representing the United States, negotiated acceptable terms and recommended a drawdown of forces until the politicians worked this whole mess out. Besides, we have, bigger problems. The British, thankfully, agreed, and both nations withdrew, leaving a token force on the island for the next 25 years until various treaties were signed resolving the dispute. And you want to know what the best part is? Nobody died. In this whole episode, nobody died. Well, except for the pig, but that doesn't count.
Oh, thank you, Anamarchy. I'm so glad you find my death funny. Oh, this is funny to you, is it? Just like Justin did in college that one time. Oh, yes, we thought he was all very clever with his teeth in his hair, prancing around like the world owned him, a new Honda Accord. But we all saw the real Justin, didn't we? Didn't we, Charlene? 2005 office Christmas.
Well, this is awkward. I'm not sure how to continue this while he rambles in the corner. I'm not sure where to go with this. Hey, you guys want to buy some heroin?
Steven, what are you doing in there?
Drugs.
Okay, now I know what some of you are thinking, and you must be rather confused. What does this have to do with the United States? The Opium Wars are, quite rightly, considered British wars. Wars that were caused by the East India Trading Company and the British government introducing narcotics into Chinese society for the express purpose of, in no particular order, destabilizing the entire country, creating a lucrative market with excessive demand, and paving the way for European colonial outposts and colonization. See Hong Kong, Macau, Canton, and Tsingtao, depending on which flavor of imperialist genocidal Europeans you prefer. But, lest we forget, this is 1856, and the United States was very intentionally spreading its influence into Asia at the time. Most famously, Commodore Matthew Perry's expedition to the Land of the Rising Sun 2 years prior. That being the arrival of the Black Ships, or the Black Ships Incident as it's known in Japan, which ended the Tokugawa shogunate's enforced isolation and began the modernization process leading to the Meiji Restoration. Thus, as part of this focus in Asia, there were numerous American business concerns operating throughout China's major port cities, owned and operated by US citizens who needed to be protected during the hostilities. The responsibility of this, of course, fell to the United States Navy, and for those among you somewhat familiar with Chinese history, you will know that US Navy ships being in China during someone else's war has often led to misunderstandings. And in this case, a rather sizable misunderstanding. Guangzhou, or Canton as it was then, is the major city on the Pearl River upstream from Hong Kong and Macau. It is one of the most important trade ports in all of Asia, and was the only trade port open to foreigners in China prior to the Western interventions in the region, meaning that's where all the diplomatic and trade missions are. So, when the conflict broke out between Britain, France, and the Chinese, the United States Navy deployed a flotilla to Guangzhou to protect American interests, American citizens, and to establish the diplomatic status of the United States regarding the conflict. USS Levant, USS Portsmouth, and USS San Jacinto, under the command of a hero of the War of 1812, Commodore James Armstrong, set sail in late October of 1856, deploying a Marine Expeditionary Unit into the city to provide security for the diplomatic mission. However, guarding the city was a collection of very well-armed heavy fortifications known as the barrier forts, complete with several very capable shore batteries and a considerably sized garrison, which could pose a serious threat if things got out of hand. With that in mind, the Americans decided, uncharacteristically, to play it cool. They stayed anchored well offshore, transiting only in daylight and sending delegations upriver into the city itself via small craft only, rather than going balls deep with the battleships, as it were. This softly diplomatic approach seemed to do the trick though, as despite the tense situation, the American consul and Chinese ambassador reached an agreement that the United States would stay neutral in the conflict and that the rights of American citizens would be respected accordingly. With the crisis seemingly averted, the Navy withdrew the Marines and started making preparations to sail, with final details to be worked out on the ground by one Commander Andrew H. Foote. But you all know there has to be some boat touching somewhere. And as Commander Foote was rowing with the shore party back to the flotilla, the Chinese troops manning the guns at the barrier forts saw a group of unarmed foreign devils not in their big powerful warships. Instead, they are in a little rowboat. A perfect target. So, they shot at him. After agreeing to a neutrality treaty, under a flag of truce, in good faith, with the American flag clearly marking them as neutral. Alright. Everyone, chill out for a second. Maybe they just didn't get the message from their commander in time. It could all be just one big misunderstanding. Tell you what, you know what we'll do? We'll send out a survey boat to check out the area, test the waters, make sure the neutrality treaty has been put into effect since last night, and maybe that will smooth things out. And they shot at the survey boat, killing the coxswain with a hail of grape shot. Well, violence it is. And when I say violence, I mean it. The Americans were livid. Attacked after signing a neutrality agreement under a flag of truce. Nah. Nope. This calls for what was the very first ever, at least from my research, trademarked and documented proportional response. But what is a proportional response? They were sent to avoid a war. The last thing they want to do is start one. Yet now there was a division of opinion. On the one hand, we're on a mission of peace. But on the other hand, one man is dead and the American flag has been dishonored. Commodore Armstrong weighed his options and decided that a full-scale shore bombardment of the Chinese forts was the best course of action. It's big, it's loud, it's a sizable retaliation, and it makes a point while keeping things proportional. The problem was their flagship, San Jacinto, had too much of a draft to venture into the shallow waters of the Pearl River, while the sloops Levant and Portsmouth needed a tow to push through the strong estuary currents upstream. Nevertheless, it was the most appropriate course of action given the tactical and political situation. So, on November 16, 1856, the flotilla's flag was transferred to the USS Portsmouth, who then proceeded to lead the journey upriver with USS Levant close behind. Both vessels under tow from two American merchant steamships, the Comfort and the Williamette. However, 15 minutes into the maneuver, disaster would strike, as USS Levant ran aground on a sandbar, bottoming her out and rendering her immobile. Portsmouth would have to carry out the mission alone. At 15:30 or 3:30 p.m., the Chinese forts opened fire on the American vessel, which promptly responded in kind. What followed was a 3-hour gunfight between the shore batteries and Portsmouth, with round ball and grape shot flying both ways in ever-increasing volume. The Chinese gunners were the first to draw blood, punching several holes in the upper hull, while grape shots shredded the rigging. But their advantage wouldn't last, as the Americans would score several hits on the gun positions, and though it didn't knock the guns out, it did kill several of the crews and a battery commander. By sunset, the Portsmouth had fired over 230 rounds, with only one casualty, a Marine who was seriously wounded by flying splinters from a hull breach. Their point emphatically made, the Americans withdrew to provide security for USS Levant, as damage control teams worked to refloat her and then get them back underway. In the meantime, Commodore Armstrong resumed negotiations with the Chinese delegation in Canton to kindly ask them what the fuck was going on. But as the diplomatic overtures began, he came down with a serious tropical infection of some kind, which caused his health to collapse. This forced him to return to the USS San Jacinto into the care of the chief surgeon of the flotilla. Following protocol, he transferred command to Captain Andrew Foote, with standing orders to forestall any Chinese attack. I'll say that again. His standing orders were to forestall any Chinese attack. End quote. Now, What he meant by that was maintain diplomatic contact while ensuring the safety of the command. But Captain Foot, while being second in command, was, if you recall, also the guy who got shot at. And he had a very different idea of what proportional meant. His orders were, word for word, to quote it again, forestall any Chinese attack. But as the old axiom goes, the best defense is a good offense. The Chinese had anywhere between 5 to 15,000 men in the Canton region, assembling to repel the British and French. These forts only had a standard garrison at the moment, and to Captain Foot, that made things very clear as to what the best way to forestall a Chinese attack was. Those forts and their guns were prime military real estate, and he had the United States Marine Corps aboard, whose sole purpose in life is real estate acquisition for the United States of America with extreme prejudice. On the 20th of November 1856, Levant and Portsmouth once again proceeded up the Pearl River. Only this time, there was a collection of small craft being towed along behind them. Small craft containing 287 armed men, led by the United States Marine Detachment, with Captain Foot in personal command. Approaching the first fort on the northern side of the river, shielded from counter-battery fire by an island midstream, the amphibious force made landfall by the small village adjacent to the redoubt, completely unopposed. Once ashore, the Marines, under their commander, Captain Sims, pushed into the village to clear their rear of potential threats, while paving the way for an attack on the first fort's rear entrance. This proved to be a sound tactical decision, as a small contingent of Chinese riflemen were garrisoned in the town to protect it against just such an attack. However, they weren't ready to deal with 50 heavily armed US Marines supported by naval gunfire. The amount of artillery emanating from Levant and Portsmouth against the first river fort was absolutely biblical, as shell after shell slammed into the battlements, while Captain Sims, in typical Marine Corps fashion, engaged the Chinese with speed, aggression, and the violence of action. The Chinese rifle team was wiped out within the hour of the initial landing, after which the cadre of 50 Marines immediately shifted to a full-scale assault on the rear of the fort at the double quick. The 200 or so Chinese troops currently being shell-shocked by the might of the US Navy heard the panic screaming of their sentries from the rear entrance and a smattering of gunfire, followed by 50 very large and very angry foreign devils with abnormally accurate aim and very large bayonets scale their walls like it was absolutely nothing and inflict on them great violence. This had the desired effect. The fortress garrison broke from their gun positions and ran out the front gate as fast as their legs would carry them, not realizing that the men they were fighting are potentially the most devoid of chill men in the entire world. The Marines occupied their former gun positions behind them, and then immediately tactically acquired their guns and began sending howitzer shells into the retreating force, along with a hail of musket fire, killing around 50 Chinese as they ran. Seeing this calamity start to unfold, the Chinese commander in Canton immediately ordered his reserve force of 1,000 men to rally the survivors and then immediately counterattack the fort before the Marines could get organized. The problem was, he fundamentally misunderstood the mentality of the United States Marine Corps, because the moment the retreating Chinese got out of range of their weapons, the Marines were now faced with their worst nightmare. They no longer had anyone to kill. They have taken their assigned real estate, and the village they'd captured didn't have any brothels. This was an unacceptable state of affairs. So they did what they always do in this situation. They immediately pursued. So when the Chinese initiated their counterattack through the rice paddies on the approach to the fortress, they walked into a coordinated ambush by Captain Sims' men, complete with artillery support from the Navy offshore and the fortress behind them. 50 Marines versus over 1,000 Chinese troops. The Chinese didn't stand a chance. Volley after volley of accurate fire eviscerated their lines as naval howitzers rained high explosive death into their rear support elements. The Marines' fire was so accurate their officers were dead in the first few minutes. 3 times the Chinese tried to advance, and 3 times they were decisively repulsed with heavy losses. After the 3rd attempt, the last surviving forward commander, probably some poor Chinese equivalent of a second lieutenant, ordered a full-scale retreat back to Canton to regroup. And with that, the Americans had taken Fort Number 1. That leaves just 3 more to go. After resting for a few hours, the Marines, along with the rest of the landing force, reboarded their small craft before dawn. And once again, under the cover of Portsmouth and Levant's guns, the Marines crossed the river, landed, and stormed the fort on the southern bank, immediately overrunning the defenders in a running firefight. This time, the Chinese reserves made the wise decision and stood back outside of gun range, none of them daring to move in while the US Navy was providing close support. One of the shore batteries did manage to score a hit on one of the boats bringing reinforcements, killing 3 sailors while wounding 5 more, but the Marines escaped unscathed and pressed the attack home. And as the final wave of the assault force climbed over the wall, Corporal William McDougall from the USS Levant raised the Stars and Stripes over the fort. That's 2 down. Now comes the hard part. Fort number 3. Napier Island, in the middle of the river, held the main fort guarding the entrance to Canton. Taking it would mean an amphibious assault on a fortified position in the middle of a fast-flowing river while potentially being in a triple crossfire. For this to be even remotely possible, they would have to clear the riverbanks and suppress the fort's guns before attempting a crossing. And so the Marines sallied forth from their newly acquired forward operations base and headed west down the embankment to get a good firing position on Napier Island, only to run headlong into a Chinese artillery battery preparing to ambush the Navy once they moved into position to provide fire support. The gun crews were just as surprised as the Marines were, but surprise violence is one of the US Marine Corps' favorite things, and they didn't see an enemy firing position. What they saw was free artillery for them to use on the next objective. A fusillade of gunfire dropped several Chinese soldiers, while the remainders immediately ran for their lives. That done, the Marines acquired the guns and turned them on the next fort's walls, resulting in a veritable typhoon of lead slamming into the fort, as rifled muskets and cannons combined with the naval howitzers aboard the 2 sloops now entering the fray. Half the garrison was wiped out while the others began to evacuate. And less than an hour later, Corporal McDougall once again raised the Star-Spangled Banner over yet another enemy fortress. In less than 48 hours, 250 Americans and 50 pit bulls in human form, with the aid of the United States Navy, had killed almost 500 men, routed 1,000 more, and seized 3 enemy coastal forts. Not bad for a weekend's work. But there was still one last fort to take. Center Fort, located on the northern bank of the river. Take that, and the city would be at their mercy. Thus, the assault would take place at dawn tomorrow. Preparations would be made throughout the night, while the Marines got some much-needed sleep, as the result of the showdown would depend upon them. Yet when the morning came, as they silently rode towards the Chinese, they were met with silence. The barrage from the captured forts and the USS Portsmouth rained hell down on the walls in front of them, but no return fire came back. Cautiously, the Marines disembarked and began wading ashore. It was then all hell broke loose, as several clouds of grape shot roared forth from the gun positions. The Marines, realizing they were in a kill zone, charged bayonets and sprinted forward, storming into the fort with weapons at the ready. Except it was empty. The shots fired at them were set on a delay fuse. The Chinese had, in their finest tradition, been doing the math, and figured out that if the Americans had taken 3 fortresses, there is a good chance they would want the 4th one. So they had booby-trapped the guns, and then done a runner, with the intent of luring them into a trap. Realizing that it could be an ambush or a trap, though, the Marines fanned out, and sure enough, there was a powder fuse burning to a gun prepped next to several barrels. Acting fast, they smothered the flame and secured the area. Once done, they began executing their standing orders. If not holding an enemy position permanently, destroy everything you can't tactically acquire. All the guns they had captured over the previous 3 days were spiked, The ammunition stores were blown, and everyone prepared to evacuate. Sadly, though, it would not be without incident, as during the demolition process underway at the last fort, the powder store suffered a premature detonation, most likely caused by a crowbar scraping across the granite walls and causing a spark. 3 sailors were killed, and 9 more were wounded. Yet this would be the only mass casualty incident during the entire battle. All counted, the United States Navy had lost 10 men killed and 21 wounded. The only Marine Corps casualty was the man wounded in the opening action. In exchange, 500 Chinese soldiers were killed, approximately double that in wounded, 176 artillery pieces were destroyed, and 4 of the strongest fortifications in the entire country had been razed to the ground along with their ammo magazines. Satisfied he had made his point, Captain Foote deemed this response proportional enough. He then resumed diplomatic communications with the Chinese ambassador in Canton, expressing his regret that such unpleasantness was necessary, but alas, America's honor required satisfaction. With that in mind, he recommended that further hostilities should be prevented at all costs. Or, in modern vernacular, try me, bitch. As you can imagine, the Chinese ambassador agreed wholeheartedly, and a treaty of neutrality was signed between the Emperor's government and the United States, ending America's official involvement in the war in exchange for the guarantee of American citizens and their business interests. And thus, the Chinese had now shown the world that even in peacetime, or as a misunderstanding, or just as an accident, touching an American's boats without their permission is not the wisest course of action. Except, there is one singular loophole in this policy. What if the people touching the boats are also Americans?
Way down south in the land of traitors, rattlesnakes and alligators, right away, come away, right away, come away. Where cotton's king and men are chattels, Union boys will win the battles right away.
I'm going to be upfront and state the obvious here. This period of American history is quite possibly the most complicated, and it is definitely the most polarizing. So this section will, by necessity, be limited in scope. And despite its inclusion in this video due to the fact that it involves touching American money, I don't particularly feel comfortable focusing on that aspect, as the money being messed with in this case had names, feelings, cultures, and families, all of whom were being tortured for profit at the hands of vindictive aristocratic bastards who manipulated and conscripted thousands of naive, impoverished farm boys to die for their right to keep doing it. So before we go any further, I'm saying this up front just to make my position and the facts very, very clear. The American Civil War was about slavery. Yet despite being primarily a land war, the Confederate States of America did a considerable amount of boat touching in admittedly rather ingenious and spectacular ways. Thus, I am going to have to talk about the most incredible ones. Which means, to set things up, I need to give some rapid-fire context. So I present to you the first half of the Civil War in under a minute. And go. The most base man in American history starts a slave revolt in Virginia which fails and results in his hanging. Northerners get mad about this, so they elect Abraham Lincoln, who says slavery is bad. Southern aristocrats don't like this, so they secede from the Union and organize militias to attack U.S. military bases, the biggest being Fort Sumter in South Carolina. Thus, Lincoln raises an army to crush the rebellion. Said army invades Virginia multiple times and loses horribly multiple times, so the U.S. Navy blockades the South, trying to contain them with the objective of sending them broke, which in turn makes the Confederates realize they have a time limit, so they go on the offensive, starting the Maryland and later Gettysburg campaigns, all while trying to break the naval blockade with multiple harebrained schemes of ever-increasing insanity. Alright. That brings us up to roughly where we need to be. If you want an actual video on the Civil War, tell me in the comments. Otherwise, for all other inquiries, to learn everything you need to know about the Civil War, I know a guy.
Checkmate, Lincolnites!
Aton Shea is the GOAT on YouTube for Civil War history, and I highly recommend him if you haven't seen him already. Anyway, it is March of 1862. The Union blockade of the Confederacy is tightening around the capital of Richmond, Virginia. The Union Army, with the aid of the US Navy, has secured the coastal towns and fortifications at the end of a long peninsula running along the James River, which culminates in the township of Hampton, Virginia, which lends its name to the James River estuary leading into the Atlantic, that name being Hampton Roads. The Confederates, at the outbreak of hostilities, had moved quickly to seize Norfolk naval yards and Newport News shipbuilders, which were, and are to this day, the largest port facilities the US Navy possesses. In fact, when the secession crisis exploded into violence, the commander of the naval yards, one Captain Charles S. Macaulay, was caught by surprise, as most of his junior officers were sympathetic to the Confederacy and kept him in the dark. So after shit actually hit the fan, and the Secretary of the Navy told him to immediately transfer his ships to the north, by the time they could get organized, it was April 20th, 1861, and too late to evacuate. With rebel forces moving in, Captain Macaulay ordered the few ships ready to sail to make best speed north. The remainder would be scuttled and the port facilities destroyed. But with no time to prepare explosives and a severe lack of trustworthy manpower, the job was a rushed one, which ultimately proved ineffective. The ships in port were set alight and most were burned beyond use, but the dry dock facilities survived completely intact. Though you will note I said most. One of the more modern ships in the yard, the steam-powered screw frigate USS Merrimac, had been decommissioned for refitting when the South seceded. When the rebels stormed the yards, she had already been burned. However, being under refit, a lot of the combustibles and fire risks were not aboard her, which meant she only burned down to the waterline. The hull and the steam engines were all still intact and able to be repaired, a fact the Confederates discovered when they pulled her into their newly repaired dry dock facilities and went, "Hey, this shit still works. Maybe we should do something with it." Which is exactly what Confederate Secretary of the Navy, one Stephen Mallory, had in mind. With the Norfolk shipyards in their possession, the South had the most capable naval construction facility in the United States. However, the rest of the fledgling slave state was, due to that very economic system, mostly agrarian. The low industrial development of the South was one of the many contributing factors to the current state of the conflict and the secession crisis itself. Even if they had the manpower and production facilities to build a navy to compete with the North, which they didn't, it would take far too long to construct a fleet powerful enough to break the blockades of their coastline. The war would either be won or lost long before such a force could be built, and that assumes the US Navy wouldn't react and ramp up its own production, which it most certainly would, and in fact did. And when you add to that the blockade firmly entrenched around their ports, the resources, money, and foreign expertise required to produce such a fleet would be impossible to acquire in the first place. You can see that this renders their strategic outlook at sea essentially hopeless. Thus, in a tinge of rather tasty irony which we mentioned earlier in this video, the only option available to the rebels was to purchase ships from Britain to serve as blockade runners, while the few warships they could build domestically had to be so ridiculously powerful that any ship the Union sailed against them would be wiped out completely in a stand-up fight. Yes, the Confederate Secretary of the Navy, Mallory, decided on the same strategy that Imperial Japan would adopt against the United States almost a century later. Import what we can't build, and what we can build will have to be insane. Yet as all of you listening must instantly realize, if naval strategy is build strategy, how are they going to build a 19th century Civil War Yamato if the war has already started? Well, that is a pretty pickle. If only there was a modern, steam-powered frigate-class vessel in their possession, which they could convert into a super-heavy warship. Oh, wait a minute. Introducing the artist formerly known as USS Merrimac, the CSS Virginia. Because of course that's what they name it. A casemate ironclad armed with 14 guns of varying calibers, 4 inches of metal plate, all of which built on top of a thick hull made from both oak and pine. And it comes fitted with, I shit you not, a fucking ram. For the sole reason that conventional ammunition wouldn't work against an enemy ironclad of equivalent class to their own design. Ergo, the best method of attack would be a for the Emperor maneuver. Overall, that idea makes an awful lot of sense. Until you consider that the steam engines fitted to the Merrimac, now the Virginia, are of an older design meant for a light screening ship, and not a hulking metal behemoth serving as a ship of the line. The result was a warship that had a top speed of 7 miles an hour and a turning circle in excess of a square mile. That isn't hyperbole, by the way. It actually did need a square mile of open water to turn around, which would take it just under an hour to do. However, if the enemy vessel was a traditional tall ship or a regular steamer, Virginia would be able to shoot it to pieces with complete impunity, while being just about immune to return fire. And if the enemy is at anchor or unable to evade for whatever reason, 4,000 tons going 7 miles an hour will make any ramming attack an instant kill. The Confederates now had their weapon to break the blockade, and though the Union knew of Virginia's existence, they had nothing available in theater which could deal with her. But that would very soon change. If the rebels were going to break the blockade decisively, they'd have to move now. On March 8, 1862, the CSS Virginia and her escorts in the James River Squadron sallied forth into the Hampton Roads Inlet to do battle with the Union blockaders currently at anchor off Newport News Point, made up of USS Cumberland and USS Congress, as well as the support squadron off the city of Hampton itself near Fort Monroe, comprising USS St. Lawrence, USS Roanoke, and USS Minnesota. First contact was made with Union shore batteries at Newport News Point early in the morning, as they saw the hulking mass of the Confederate Navy superweapon steaming menacingly towards them. The gunners managed to temporarily disable the converted steamer CSS Patrick Henry, but any shots aimed at Virginia either didn't hit or just bounced harmlessly off. The cannonade immediately raised the alarm all along the Hampton Roads Channel. Union sailors ran to action stations in order to get their ships underway as soon as possible. They knew a direct confrontation with Virginia would be suicidal unless they could get into open water and use superior numbers combined with tactical maneuver to overcome her. Unfortunately, the warning had come far too late, as by the time the Confederates had been spotted, they were already within engagement range of Cumberland and Congress. The captain of Virginia, Commodore Frank Buchanan, ordered firing to commence on all Union vessels in range. All ahead flank, turn heading 350, straight at USS Cumberland. Brace for ram. The Union sailors were steadfast in their duty. Their guns roared constantly, scoring hit after hit after hit. It just didn't matter. Virginia shrugged them off, while her return fire shredded through the hull at point-blank range, inflicting devastating damage. Then, at around 14:30 hours, Virginia slammed into Cumberland's starboard bow at full speed. The impact was devastating, shattering the hull, which immediately began taking on water. However, Virginia didn't get out unscathed. Her ram got caught in her victim, locking the two ships together while exposing the vulnerable top armor to point-blank return fire, which Cumberland's sailors continued to send their way. Commodore Buchanan immediately ordered all back full to break free from Cumberland so they could continue the attack. Except in doing this, the improvised ram caught on the rapidly sinking wreck, resulting in the port side of the ram blade being torn off, causing a leak in the bow compartment. Nevertheless, they got free, and immediately began a U-turn in order to engage USS Congress, who, having witnessed what had happened to their comrades, grounded herself on a sandbar to ensure that she would stay afloat even in the case of a ram. The Confederates were too close to try and escape. They would just get shot to pieces while attempting to flee. Even as Virginia slowly turned around, the James River Squadron was already flinging shots their way. They also needed to draw as much fire as possible, given that their support flotilla near Hampton Harbor had all tried to get underway, only for all three of them to unintentionally run aground, rendering them all completely helpless. If Virginia managed to get amongst them with her group, they could potentially sink the entire blockading force, which would be a complete disaster in every possible sense. So, USS Congress opened fire on Virginia with everything she had to draw her attention, which worked exactly as they had intended. Only none of their shots did any damage, and like her compatriots, Congress also couldn't move. Commodore Buchanan wasted no time. The moment Virginia had reversed course, she steamed towards Congress for a full broadside engagement. They would tank the enemy's return fire while shredding the wooden ship to pieces, while the James River Squadron would encircle and pummel their quarry into submission. The following battle was utterly one-sided, and despite the heroic efforts from Congress's crew, she was utterly torn to shreds by rebel cannon fire. After only 1 hour of combat, she struck her colours in surrender and began evacuating the ship. Commodore Buchanan went on the top deck to oversee proceedings, only to be struck by a stray rifle round fired from the shore batteries on Newport News, which was quickly followed by accurate cannon fire. The Union shore gunners had seen an opportunity in the lull, caused by Congress's surrender, to violate the truce and try to disable Virginia. In response, the now wounded Buchanan ordered incendiary hotshot to be loaded into his guns and fired on the US ship, despite the evacuations not being complete. This would cause the deaths of over 100 men. With this done, the Confederate task force turned their attentions towards the grounded squadron at Hampton Roads proper, quickly homing in on the USS Minnesota. But before they could initiate contact, the sun began to properly set, the only light being from the still fiercely burning wreck of the Congress. Unable to accurately aim in the darkness, and the tide steadily receding, it would be too dangerous to press their advantage. Thus, the rebel fleet turned back to friendly waters, docking at Sewell's Point nearby to repair their battle damage and offload their wounded, in preparation to finish off the remaining Union ships in the morning. Commodore Buchanan was relieved by his first officer, the dislodged iron plates were refitted, the damaged guns were replaced, and everyone got some much-needed sleep. Come dawn, they would settle things. Only it didn't quite work out that way. On the morning of March 9th, 1862, CSS Virginia and the James River Squadron sallied forth once more for the bloody business of the day. However, before they could get amongst their still grounded and defenseless victims, they found their axis of attack blocked by a bizarre-looking vessel unlike anything the world had ever seen. It looked like a giant steel drum just floating in space, the waves washing over a mostly submerged hull, with a small metal box sticking out the front, very obviously serving as some form of pilot house. And despite never having seen it, everyone aboard CSS Virginia knew it could only be one ship. They had read about it in the newspapers, where Southern journalists had nicknamed it, rather derisively, the Yankee Cheese Box. The deployment of their mighty vessel had scared Washington shitless. In fact, they had scared them enough to send their arch-rival, the only ship in the United States Navy that could confront them, the other heavily armed ironclad in the Eastern Theater. Standing in their way was USS Monitor. This was the ship that pioneered the use of heavily armored and armed turrets as a primary weapon system, as opposed to the standard casemate filled with gun ports. It appeared that an epic showdown to settle the outcome of the entire naval campaign was about to take place. Only there was one slight problem. Both vessels were designed to destroy conventional warships, not other ironclads. So as Virginia and Monitor closed in on one another, their guns roaring as they went, nothing happened. The only shot that did any damage was a shot that Virginia missed, which ended up hitting USS Minnesota instead. For the next several hours, the ironclads sent shell after shell after shell into one another, while doing practically no damage. Plates came loose from their armor, and one of Monitor's turret's crewmen got a serious concussion from a direct hit on the gun mantlet, while he was lazily leaning against it, so that's really on him. But apart from that, neither ship could hurt the other. Eventually, though, Virginia got a lucky shot against the pilot house, which temporarily blinded Monitor. This prompted the Union vessel to turn about and gain some distance to reorient themselves. Believing they'd won a great victory, the rebels also chose to withdraw, as their plates had taken a beating and they were running low on ammo. So when Monitor turned around to continue the engagement, the Confederates had gone. Minnesota had been saved, and the blockade remained enforced. Thus, both sides loudly proclaimed victory in the newspapers. The problem now was that neither side had decisively won, so they were locked in a stalemate. So how were they going to resolve the stalemate? And the answer they came up with was, don't bother. After the first ironclad versus ironclad confrontation in naval history, and the most famous naval battle of the Civil War, both sides ended up playing one of the longest games of chicken in military history. For the rest of the year, both Virginia and Monitor would sail up and down the James River, trying to goad the other into accepting battle on their terms. And of course, neither side committed, because what idiot fights a battle on his enemy's terms? Essentially, two fleets in being based around ironclads foretold in microcosm what would happen between Germany and Britain in World War I. A staring contest over a blockade that had one big blow-up, and then nothing happens. Yet before the end of the year, both ships would be gone, neither of which caused by enemy fire. CSS Virginia stayed in her base at Norfolk, being big and scary, only for the Army of the Potomac under George McClellan to kick off the aforementioned Peninsula Campaign. Given the Confederates weren't going to win the war at sea, the troops holding Norfolk abandoned the city to join Robert E. Lee in his defense of Richmond. Only as they were leaving, nobody bothered to tell the Navy they were going. So after all that effort, all those resources, and their heroic first battle, Virginia would be scuttled on May the 9th, 1862. And as for USS Monitor, turns out building a warship without a seafaring hull isn't exactly the smartest idea when trying to wage war on the Atlantic coast. After Virginia's scuttling, it was determined that the heavily armoured vessel would be far more useful in supporting operations deeper into Confederate waters. So, on Christmas Day 1862, she began sailing south to the shores of North Carolina, where she would get caught in an absolutely biblical Atlantic winter storm. Without a proper keel and hull, the rain, combined with the high waves, swamped Monitor from bow to stern, the water flooding through the pilot house and the turret. She would sink on New Year's Eve 1862, with the loss of 14 men. The naval history of the American Civil War is, in my view, best encapsulated by the Battle of Hampton Roads. Small-scale naval engagements in rivers or shallows, characterized either by emergent technology or incredible audacity, all set against the backdrop of a relentless Union blockade of the South. The blockade-running antics of the Confederate Navy are worth a video by themselves, and the most legendary ship among them was the CSS Alabama. The Union's efforts to sink her led to several incredible episodes, the wildest one being the Battle of the Shimonoseki Straits, where the USS Wyoming, who in her efforts to hunt down Alabama and her elusive sisters, ended up off the coast of Japan. And her timing was awful, because they had arrived during the crisis caused by Emperor Meiji's father, Emperor Komei, and his order to, and I quote, expel the foreign barbarians, which subsequently resulted in the US Navy's first victory over the Empire of Japan, after the Mori clan in the Choshu domain decided it would be a good idea to send 3 hopelessly obsolete vessels against a modern American warship, which had the predictable result of USS Wyoming completely obliterating 2 of them while crippling the 3rd. But we will discuss the climactic finale of the hunt for Alabama later, because I'm talking about insane boat touching during the Civil War, which means I have to talk about the other Confederate superweapon. It's time to talk about submarines. Before the Civil War began, there had been numerous experiments in the US Navy going as far back as the Revolution. Hell, it wasn't just the Americans. Prototypes for submarines have existed since antiquity. But with the advent of engines, pumps, explosives, and other modern technologies, it was finally being properly pursued as a practical weapon system. And with the Union outnumbering them 10-1 while blockading their entire coastline, the Confederacy, like their ideological cousins in the German Spicy Pinwheel Gang, drew the same conclusion. If our heavily armoured super battleships aren't working, we're going to need to sneak past. Meaning we are going to need some U-boats. This strategic requirement resulted in several designs being proposed by the Southern nautical engineer Horace Lawson Hunley. The first prototype was built in New Orleans and named Pioneer, which, despite being a prototype, looked relatively forward-thinking in its design. It featured a fixed periscope porthole, dive planes, and a deployable torpedo, which featured a timed clockwork fuse to be initiated after the weapon is manually screwed onto the hull of an enemy vessel. kind of similar in concept to a limpet mine, only deployed below the surface. Yet, as it was an experimental weapon system operating in an exceedingly dangerous environment, it would be incredibly dangerous to test. However, the Confederates had a unique and distinct advantage in this area, that being a readily available supply of human beings their society considered expendable. The first test dives, done with the CSS Pioneer, were carried out using enslaved African Americans to test its feasibility. Exact information on this phase of testing is not known, but it is believed that at least one recovery operation had to be mounted after the crew, who being slaves were neither educated nor trained, got stuck in the silt on the riverbed and suffocated. Nevertheless, enough progress was made and data collected to continue development of the prototype into a fully serviceable weapon system. Except they ran into a serious issue in the fact that by the time they had gotten it all working, it was May of 1862. By now, the Union had crushed the rebels in the Western Theatre and were at that very moment marching through Lafayette Square to take them all prisoner. So they had to scuttle the sub before it fell into Yankee hands. But the Confederates were not going to give up. With the enemy making dramatic gains against the Confederacy, time was of the essence. Hundley and his team relocated to Mobile, Alabama, where they began work on a second version of their submarine, Pioneer 2, or the American Diver. This design was bigger, longer, girthier, and more heavily armed. It had even more novel technology crammed inside it as well, with disposable keel plates to control depth, a streamlined wedge shape to maximize compartment space while minimizing hydrodynamic drag, and amazingly enough, for an electric and even a compact steam motor. Spoiler alert, it didn't work. Thus, the experimental engines were replaced with a crew of 4 men operating a hand crank. Eventually, in early 1863, Pioneer 2 was ready to be tested. The blockade of Mobile, Alabama was devastating the local economy while posing the existential threat of artillery attack. So Hundley and his team assembled the crew, armed the torpedo, and began towing the submarine to its launch position, where it immediately floundered and sank in the strong currents. Well, back to the drawing board it was. If they were going to make this work, they needed to go all in. They scaled up the design to an 8-man crew, added a snorkel system, attached an even bigger warhead on the end of a stick, known as a spar torpedo. They improved the control system, and finally, being the modest sort of chief engineer he was, Hundley called it the Hundley. Worked well enough for James Watt, I guess. But it didn't help him with the Confederate Naval Appropriations Board, who, after losing the 2 prototypes, decided to seize his submarine in full for the war effort without paying him. So much for states' rights and liberty, huh? Though I guess when you buy and sell human beings, fair dealing is a relative concept. This did have an unfortunate side effect, however, in that the engineering team which built the highly experimental crank-powered submarine had just gotten their work stolen and weren't members of the military who could be ordered to stay on. So you now have to operate one of the world's first ever combat submarines by reading a couple of basic operator's notes scrawled in the margins of a set of blueprints you don't understand. This, predictably, led to the first test voyage causing the deaths of 5 men, after the captain, Lieutenant John A. Payne, accidentally stepped on the dive plane's control before they had closed the hatches, which in turn floundered the submarine. And with only 2 very narrow hatches for exits that were rapidly filling with water, only the captain and 2 crewmen escaped. The other 5 men drowned. This failure proved to the general commanding the area, one P.T. Beauregard, that the Navy were a bunch of amateurs, not to mention that the survivors turned around and flat up refused to get back in the thing, rightfully so in my opinion. So the Confederate Navy had their submarine seized in turn by the Confederate Army, who then sourced a new crew, which included going back to Horace Hundley cap in hand and asking him to come back and help. Horace decided to be uncharacteristically magnanimous and agreed. And once he'd gotten the new crew up to speed and actually made some successful test dives, they carried out combat trials against static targets in the harbour. And on October 15th, 1863, they successfully sank an old barge in the harbour, proving their weapon systems worked. It was a rather spectacular demonstration that wowed the onlookers. Except Hunley, neither the man nor the submarine resurfaced. During the demonstration, the submarine had once again sunk with all hands, along with its chief designer. But on the other hand, it proved it could work, so 8 more men were found, the submarine was raised, the 8 corpses were pulled out, and a new torpedo was fitted. They had their secret weapon. And so, on February 17th, 1864, the CSS Hunley stealthily paddled into the harbour of Charleston, South Carolina, for its first combat mission. The blockade must be broken. The captain of the Hunley, Lieutenant George Dixon, began the patrol around Charleston Harbour, scanning for a target to attack. And at around 8:30 p.m., he spotted the USS Housatonic, a Union 20-gun screw sloop anchored in the harbour entrance. Slowly, the rebel submarine started moving into attack position, and 15 minutes later, they began their run. The men aboard the Union ship had absolutely no warning. The lookouts on deck scanned the surface, seeing nothing. It wouldn't be until the last 100 yards that they knew anything was even there. A squat cylindrical shape, drawing a foamy wake in the otherwise calm waters of the night, approached them from out of the darkness, and despite having no idea what it was, the Marines aboard figured that if it was an unknown object coming from the rebel lines, it most definitely wasn't friendly. Small arms fire started ringing out as the Hunley approached its mark, but though they were shallow, they were still submerged. The enemy fire had no effect. With less than 5 minutes warning, there was nothing the crew of USS Housatonic could do. An earth-shaking explosion shattered the tranquility of the night as flames arced skywards. The Hunley had struck its target just aft of amidships, damn near cutting the stern of the Union ship clean off, while completely rupturing the hull in the process. USS Housatonic was flooded with a raging torrent of water that was entirely impossible to stop. She sank in less than 3 minutes, taking 5 men with her. This was a momentous moment in naval history, as the first successful kill by a military submarine in the history of war at sea. However, it was a victory the crew of the Hunley paid for with their lives. After they failed to return, it remained a mystery for over a century as to what happened to the submarine, until the wreck was recovered completely intact in the harbour, very close to the wreck of USS Housatonic. No emergency procedures had been followed, such as snorkel deployment, a purge of the ballast, or even open hatches. There was no evidence suggesting it had been sunk via damage or a systems failure. It wasn't until scientists and archaeologists examined the remains of the crew that they realized what had happened. Everyone on board was very well preserved, and everyone was located at their battle stations, meaning there had been no attempt to evacuate, nor had they realized anything was wrong. And it was this fact that gave them their answer. Because Hunley used a contact torpedo mounted on a spar, when they had increased the warhead size, they hadn't accounted for the explosive pressure waves effects through the water. So when Hunley had struck Housatonic, the blast wave from the explosion killed everyone inside the pressure hull, while leaving the submarine itself completely intact. Nevertheless, despite their historical achievement, the Union had by then won the war decisively on land. William Tecumseh did nothing wrong. Sherman had been laying waste to the Confederates in Georgia, razing everything in his path, while Ulysses S. Grant marched inexorably southwards towards Richmond, the head of the slave-holding snake. But the U.S. Navy had one last mission to complete. It had yet to neutralize the rebel blockade runners, and CSS Alabama was still at large, raising havoc all across the Atlantic. Something would have to be done. And in June of 1864, the rebel flagship's luck would finally run out. CSS Alabama had been built and commissioned in Britain at the John Laird Shipbuilding Company in Liverpool, and once she had entered service in early 1862, she ran the US Navy ragged for 2.5 years straight, capturing or sinking over 65 Union ships of various types across 7 war patrols. But without the raw logistical capacity that the Union possessed, she had been unable to undergo the extensive refits and maintenance cycles that a modern warship needs to go through in order to maintain its combat effectiveness. And given that the Union fleet was blockading every single southern port that hadn't already been captured by marauding US Army forces, who could seemingly march across Dixie at will, their only choice was to undergo a refit in a neutral European nation where they could hire a local yard. This came with serious risks, as if they were caught in a neutral port, there would be absolutely no escape. But with her engines shot to pieces, the crew exhausted, and the various mechanical systems aboard ship having been severely worn down, they didn't have a choice. So, CSS Alabama pulled into the dry docks of Cherbourg, France, on the 11th of June 1864. Yet unfortunately for them, their nemesis, the USS Kearsarge, had been hot on her trail. In fact, they had been specifically hunting her from ports in Europe since she launched in 1862. And finally, after all this time, Kearsarge had finally cornered her quarry exactly where she wanted her, anchoring outside of the neutral port, blockading Alabama in. The showdown had finally come, whether the rebels wanted it or not. Captain Raphael Semmes of the CSS Alabama knew he was up against the wall. He also knew that the Confederacy didn't have that many ships, which meant every single one of their ships sunk were irreplaceable. And the Yankees knew it too. If he stayed here and tried to wait them out, another 5 US Navy vessels would show up in short order. In fact, unbeknownst to him, the captain of Kearsarge, one John Winslow, had already called for reinforcements the moment he had arrived on the 14th. If the Confederates were to have any chance of survival, they would have to stage a breakout, sink their tormentor, and find another port they could refit in safe from Union pursuit. Thus, Captain Semmes spent the next several days drilling his men relentlessly, while the maintenance teams worked around the clock to do what they could with what they had. For by the week's end, they would either win or die. On the morning of June 19th, 1864, CSS Alabama, escorted by a French warship to ensure these crazy Americans didn't shoot each other to pieces inside French national waters, sailed forth to confront her nemesis, and USS Kearsarge happily accepted battle. The showdown was on. The two vessels immediately opened fire once they had entered gun range, with Alabama firing the first shot. This initiated a single combat where each ship jostled for position, trying to cross the other's T. The result was an ever-tightening death spiral as both sides tried to get in front of the other, and with the ever-decreasing range, shots were starting to hit home. For the rebels, however, their hopes would be utterly dashed. USS Kearsarge had done an impromptu refit to her armor scheme the previous year by fortifying her main armor belt with a layer of interlaced heavy-duty iron chains, essentially creating a giant piece of naval chainmail. When Alabama's rounds slammed into the side of Kearsarge, she shrugged it off with practically no damage. Worse still, the Confederates' gunpowder and munitions had to be acquired in bulk and then stored for long periods, as there was generally no guarantee of supply at friendly ports due to the blockade, resulting in misfires and low-velocity shots from her guns that either fell short or failed to do any damage at all. USS Kearsarge, meanwhile, had the latest in modern cannons, fresh supplies, and a score to settle. The Union ship delivered constant and accurate fire, her 11-inch Dahlgren guns smashing multiple holes in Alabama below the waterline. After only an hour of combat, the CSS Alabama began sinking by the stern. Captain Raphael Semmes struck the Confederate colors from the mast and dispatched a dinghy with a request for rescue, as he and his men abandoned ship. The Confederate flagship was no more. Yet Captain Semmes would end up having the last laugh though, as one of the nearby ships that responded to the obvious distress of the Alabama, once it had surrendered of course, was the British yacht Deerhound, who collected the bridge officers and several crewmen, only to set course for Southampton directly instead of turning him over to the USS Kearsarge conducting a rescue nearby, meaning Semmes and his command staff, despite losing the battle after being blockaded in Cherbourg, and essentially being wanted fugitives, would make it to England and get away with it scot-free. Eventually, after a long and perilous journey, he would return to the Confederacy via Cuba, just in time to lose the war. As on April 9th, 1865, in the small town of Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia, General Robert E. Lee surrendered the Army of Northern Virginia to the commander of all Union forces, Ulysses S. Grant. And he surrendered in the front parlor of a house belonging to a Virginian landowner, one Wilmer McLean. He had been forced to move from his original home because his original home was a farmhouse at Manassas Junction, which had been damaged during the first major battle of the war, known as the First Battle of Bull Run. Later, he would famously say, "The war started in my front yard and ended in my front parlor." What truly mattered, though, was that the war had ended, and with its ending came the enforcement nationwide of the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution, abolishing the practice of institutional slavery. After 100 years of history, after a century of bickering, vacillating, and trying to rationalize this great experiment in democracy, America had finally taken its first steps into becoming what it was always meant to be. No longer was it these United States, now it was the United States. One nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. And while to this day it has yet to achieve that ideal, prison slavery still exists, there is constant racial tension, enormous poverty, rights of women and minority groups are consistently under attack, to say nothing about foreign interventionism and corrupt politicians ruling the roost from Washington. This moment, as well as many others that would come later, proved that despite everything, if its citizens believed it, and good men and women strived for it, America could achieve it. Yet it was still the mid-19th century. The industrial age was sweeping the globe. Capitalism was continuing its ascent into dominating the world's markets, and the last great age of imperialism had begun. There was still a great many things to do, and with these new opportunities in front of them, along with a nation to rebuild, America once more sent her boats across the length and breadth of the earth in search of power, wealth, empire, and opportunity. The question is, who else would be dumb enough to touch them?